Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The antique mirror came with the house, or so the realtor told me. I should have asked more questions, but 3 months after Sarah left, I wasn't thinking clearly about much of anything. The Victorian on Maple Street was within my budget, barely, and the mirror in the master bedroom seemed like the least of my concerns. It was an ornate thing, nearly floor to ceiling, with an elaborate brass frame that had turned green in places. The glass itself was old, the kind that warps your reflection slightly, making you look taller and thinner than you actually are. I remember thinking it was probably worth more than I'd paid for the entire house. The first few weeks were consumed with boxes and settling in, the way new places always are. I worked from home now, freelance graphic design, which meant I spent most of my time in the converted office downstairs. The bedroom mirror became just another piece of furniture, something I glanced at while getting dressed in the mornings. Nothing more. It was during the third week that I first noticed the delay. I was brushing my teeth before bed, standing at the dresser across from the mirror, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, my reflection was still catching up, the ghostly image of myself turning a split second after I had actually moved. I stood there for a moment, toothbrush hanging from my mouth, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't. I convinced myself it was fatigue. The divorce had been exhausting, and I'd been working long hours to distract myself from the silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. But over the following days, I found myself paying more attention to the mirror. Not deliberately, I wasn't the type to become obsessed with supernatural nonsense. It was more like how you might notice a loose floorboard after stepping on it once. Your awareness becomes heightened to that particular spot. The delay happened again on a Thursday morning. I was putting on a shirt, and when I looked up, my reflection was still pulling the fabric over its head, while I had already moved on to buttoning it. This time I stopped and stared directly at the mirror. My reflection stared back, perfectly synchronized now, but there was something in its eyes that made my stomach turn. It was me, certainly. Same tired lines around the eyes. Same stubble I'd been too lazy to shave, but there was an alertness there that I didn't feel. Like it was studying me as much as I was studying it. I spent the rest of that day trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Old mirrors could create optical illusions. The glass was wavy, imperfect. The lighting in the bedroom was dim. There were a dozen reasonable explanations. But that night I dreamed about the mirror. In the dream I was standing in front of it, but my reflection wasn't moving at all. It stood perfectly still while I waved my arms, jumped up and down, made faces. The reflection just watched with that same alert expression, its head tilted slightly as if considering something important. When I woke up, I was standing in front of the mirror. My feet were bare on the cold hardwood floor, and I was wearing only boxers and a t-shirt. According to the digital clock on the nightstand, it was 3:17 a.m. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of walking across the room. But there I was, close enough to the mirror that my breath was fogging the glass. My reflection looked tired. More tired than I felt, actually. Its shoulders were slumped in a way that mine weren't, and there were dark circles under its eyes that seemed deeper than what I saw in bathroom mirrors during the day. I backed away slowly and returned to bed. But I didn't sleep again that night. The sleepwalking, if that's what it was, became a pattern. Every few nights I'd wake up standing in front of the mirror, always at the same time, 3:17 a.m. I tried keeping a journal, tracking what I ate, how much I drank, my stress levels, anything that might explain the episodes. Nothing correlated. Also started paying closer attention to my reflection during daylight hours. The delays were becoming more frequent and more pronounced. Sometimes my reflection would finish a movement several seconds after I had stopped. Other times it would begin moving before I did, as if it had anticipated what I was going to do. The worst part was the expression. My reflection always looked more alert than I felt, more aware. It was like looking at a version of myself that knew something I didn't. 3 weeks into October, I decided to test something. I stood in front of the mirror with a notepad and wrote down a series of numbers, 47193. Then I held the notepad up to the mirror and watched my reflection do the same. But the numbers on my reflection's notepad were different. 39174, the exact reverse order. I stared at the notepad in the mirror, then looked down at my own notepad, then back at the mirror. The numbers had changed back to match mine, but I'd seen what I'd seen. My reflection had been writing the numbers in reverse order while I was writing them forward. That night I moved into the guest bedroom, but it didn't matter. I still woke up at 3:17 a.m., and I was still standing in front of the master bedroom mirror, 30 feet from where I'd gone to sleep. My reflection was waiting for me, and this time it was holding something. A photograph. I couldn't make out the details in the dim light, but my reflection held it up to the glass as if showing it to me. When I reached toward the mirror to get a better look, my reflection shook its head slowly and lowered the photograph. The next morning I searched through boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, looking for photo albums. I found what I was looking for in a box labeled Sarah's Things. Photographs from our relationship that I'd been too sentimental to throw away but too hurt to display. I spread them out on the kitchen table and went through them one by one. Most were happy memories. Vacations, anniversaries, ordinary moments that had seemed worth preserving. But near the bottom of the pile, I found it. The photograph was from 2 years ago, taken at Sarah's sister's wedding. We were standing together, near the dance floor, but we weren't looking at the camera. We were looking at each other, and the expression on Sarah's face was one I'd forgotten, or maybe chosen not to remember. She was looking at me with such sadness, such resignation, like she'd already made a decision that I wasn't aware of yet. I'd always assumed Sarah left because of the fights we'd been having, the growing distance between us. But looking at this photograph, I realized she'd been leaving long before our relationship officially ended. I'd just been too self-absorbed to notice. That night I didn't even try to sleep in the guest bedroom. I sat in a chair facing the mirror, waiting. At 3:17 a.m. I felt the familiar pull, the compulsion to stand, but this time I fought it. I gripped the arms of the chair and forced myself to stay seated. In the mirror, my reflection stood up anyway. We stared at each other, me sitting in the chair, my reflection standing beside the mirror. It held up the photograph again, and this time I could see it clearly. It was the picture from Sarah's sister's wedding. But in the mirror, Sarah was looking directly out at me instead of at my reflection. Her expression was even sadder than I remembered. My reflection pointed at the photograph, then at me, then back at the photograph. It was trying to tell me something, but I was too afraid to understand. "What do you want?" I whispered. My reflection set the photograph down and picked up something else. A hand mirror, one I didn't recognize. It held it up and angled it toward me, creating an infinite tunnel of reflection stretching back into impossibility. In those endless reflections, I saw myself at different ages, different moments. I saw myself ignoring Sarah when she tried to talk about her day. I saw myself forgetting anniversaries, missing signals, choosing work over conversation. I saw myself becoming someone who was easier to love from a distance. My reflection lowered the hand mirror and looked at me with something that might have been pity. Then it picked up the photograph one more time and pressed it against the mirror's surface from the inside. I understood then. The mirror wasn't showing me what was. It was showing me what I'd refused to see. My reflection wasn't more alert than me. It was the part of me that had been paying attention all along, the part I'd been ignoring. I reached out and pressed my palm against the glass, matching my reflection's gesture. The mirror was cold, but underneath the chill, I could feel something else. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. When I pulled my hand away, my reflection had changed. It looked tired now, the same kind of tired I felt. The alertness was gone, replaced by something more human, more honest. I never woke up in front of the mirror again after that night. But sometimes, when I'm getting dressed in the morning or brushing my teeth before bed, I catch my reflections. And we nod at each other. An acknowledgement between two versions of the same person. Both of us finally paying attention. The photograph is still there, pressed against the mirror's surface from the inside, visible only at certain angles in the right light. A reminder of what I couldn't see when it mattered most, and what I'm learning to see now. I still live in the house on Maple Street. I kept the mirror. Some people might think that's strange, but I've come to understand that we all need something that watches us, something that remembers what we'd rather forget, something that shows us who we really are when we're not performing for the world. The mirror watches. And now, finally, so do I. Whispers in room 217. The Grandview Hotel had been my sanctuary for 3 months before I heard the first whisper. I'd taken the job as night auditor, not out of any particular love for hospitality, but because the isolation suited me. After Sarah's accident, I couldn't bear the weight of sympathetic glances or the careful way people modulated their voices around me, as if speaking too loudly might shatter what remained of my composure. The hotel's graveyard shift offered exactly what I needed. Quiet hours, minimal human contact, and a paycheck that kept me from having to return to the apartment we'd shared. The Grandview itself was a relic from the 1920s, all Art Deco flourishes and faded grandeur. Most nights I had the place nearly to myself. Just the occasional businessman or weary traveler checking in past midnight. The lobby's marble floors echoed with every footstep, and the ornate chandelier cast dancing shadows that moved with the slightest air current. I'd grown comfortable with these sounds and movements, the way you adapt to the rhythm of an old house settling. But room 217 was different. It sat at the end of the second-floor hallway, isolated from the other guest rooms by a service corridor that led to the old ballroom. The room itself was unremarkable. Queen bed, mahogany desk, a view of the alley behind the building. What made it notable was its occupancy rate. In my 3 months, I'd only checked 2 guests into 217, and both had requested room changes before dawn. The first was a traveling salesman named Peterson. He'd appeared at my desk at 4 a.m., pale and agitated, claiming the room was too noisy. When I asked what kind of noise, he'd just shaken his head and said he'd rather sleep in his car. I'd moved him to 312 without question. Customer service demanded it. But I'd made a mental note to inspect 217 the next day. I'd found nothing wrong. The room was immaculate, recently renovated, with new carpeting and fresh paint. The air conditioning worked perfectly. The plumbing was silent. I'd even spent an hour sitting in the armchair by the window, listening for any unusual sounds from the adjacent rooms or the street below. Nothing. The second guest was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman visiting her daughter. She'd lasted until 6 a.m. before appearing in the lobby, her suitcase already packed. She'd been more specific than Peterson. mentioning voices in the walls, conversations she couldn't quite make out, but that had kept her awake all night. I'd offered her 318, and she'd accepted gratefully, though she'd kept glancing toward the elevator as if expecting something to follow her down. After Mrs. Chen's experience, I'd started paying closer attention to room 217. During my nightly rounds, I'd pause outside its door, listening. Sometimes I thought I heard something, a faint murmur like voices from a television turned low, but whenever I used my master key to investigate, the room was empty and silent. It was on a Tuesday in late October that I first heard them clearly. Was reviewing the night's receipts when the sound drifted down from the second floor. Voices, definitely voices, engaged in what sounded like conversation. The words weren't distinct, but the cadence was unmistakable. Question, answer, pause, laughter. The kind of intimate dialogue you'd expect from a couple settling in for the night. But 217 was vacant. I'd checked the system 3 times. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my master key already in hand. The hallway was dimly lit by the vintage sconces that management insisted on keeping for atmosphere. As I approached 217, the voices became clearer, though I still couldn't make out individual words. They seemed to be speaking just below the threshold of comprehension, like a radio station not quite tuned in. I pressed my ear to the door. 2 voices, definitely. 1 male, 1 female. They were discussing something with apparent urgency, their tones rising and falling in patterns that suggested disagreement, then reconciliation. The woman laughed, a sound that made my chest tighten with unexpected familiarity. The key turned, smoothly in the lock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The voices stopped instantly as if I'd walked into a library reading room. The silence was absolute, almost aggressive in its completeness. The room was empty, of course, but something felt wrong. The air seemed denser, as if recently disturbed by movement. The temperature was noticeably cooler than the hallway, and there was a faint scent I couldn't identify, something floral and slightly stale, like flowers left too long in water. I stood there for several minutes, my breathing the only sound in the room. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. I made another mental note and returned to the lobby. The voices became a nightly occurrence. Always at 3:17, always lasting exactly 11 minutes, always stopping the moment I opened the door. I began timing them, documenting their frequency and duration in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. The pattern never varied. What did vary was my reaction to them. At first, I'd approached 217 with professional curiosity. Hotels had quirks, after all. Old buildings settled, pipes carried sounds from other rooms, and the heating system could create acoustical anomalies. But as the nights passed, I found myself anticipating 317 with something approaching dread. The voices were becoming more familiar. Not the words, I still couldn't make those out, but the rhythms, the inflections, the emotional textures of the conversation. The woman's laugh in particular had begun to haunt me. I'd catch myself listening for it during the day, that brief musical sound that seemed to echo something buried deep in my memory. It was Sarah's laugh. The realization hit me on a Thursday night in November. I was sitting in the lobby when the voices began, and something about the woman's tone, teasing, affectionate, slightly mocking, transported me back to our kitchen on a Sunday morning 6 months ago. Sarah had been making pancakes, flour dusting her dark hair, and she'd laughed in exactly that way when I'd complained about the mess she was making. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs to 217. This time I didn't use the key. I pressed my ear to the door and listened with the desperate attention of someone trying to decode a message in a foreign language. The man's voice was mine. Lower, muffled by the door, but unmistakably mine. The conversation I was hearing was one Sarah and I had shared, though I couldn't place when or where. They were discussing travel plans, I thought, or maybe dinner reservations. The kind of mundane couples negotiation that fills the spaces between more significant moments. When I finally opened the door, the silence felt accusatory. The room was empty, but the floral scent was stronger now, and I recognized it. Sarah's perfume, the one she'd worn on special occasions, the one I donated to Goodwill along with her clothes because I couldn't bear to smell it on her pillow. I began researching the hotel's history. The Grandview had opened in 1923, during the height of the Jazz Age, and had hosted its share of notable guests over the decades. But Room 217 had no particular significance that I could discover. No famous deaths, no tragic love affairs, no documented paranormal activity. The room had been renovated multiple times, most recently in 2018, and there were no complaints in the records prior to Peterson's visit. The voices continued, and I continued to listen. I'd given up trying to rationalize them away. Whatever was happening in room 217 was beyond my understanding, but it was happening, and it was connected to Sarah in ways that both terrified and comforted me, because that's what the voices were becoming. Comfort. Despite their impossible nature, despite the way they made my skin crawl and my hands shake, I began to look forward to 317. For 11 minutes each night, I could hear Sarah's voice again, could listen to the easy intimacy of our conversations, could pretend that she was still somewhere in the world, still laughing at my jokes and negotiating the small details of our shared life. I started arriving at 217 a few minutes early, positioning myself outside the door before the voices began. I'd close my eyes and let the familiar patterns wash over, me picking out individual words and phrases that triggered specific memories. The night she'd convinced me to drive to the coast on a whim. The morning we'd discussed adopting a cat. The evening we'd fought about my mother's visit and then reconciled over Chinese takeout. These weren't random conversations. They were our conversations, drawn from the 3 years we'd spent together, replaying in a sequence I couldn't predict but always recognized. The voices in room 217 were creating a memorial to our relationship, one 11-minute segment at a time. I should have been terrified. I should have requested a transfer, or quit, or sought professional help. Instead, I found myself staying late, coming in early, volunteering for extra shifts. The hotel's management was pleased with my dedication. My predecessor had been unreliable. They said, always complaining about the building's quirks. The first time I heard the accident, I nearly collapsed. It was a Tuesday in December, snow falling past the lobby's tall windows, when the voices took on a different quality. Instead of the intimate conversation I'd grown accustomed to, I heard anxiety, urgency, fear. Sarah's voice was high and tight, the way it got when she was genuinely worried about something. My own voice was attempting reassurance, but there was an undercurrent of irritation I remembered too well. We were discussing her decision to drive to her sister's house despite the weather. I was trying to talk her out of it, suggesting she wait until morning, pointing out that the roads were already icy. She was insisting she'd be fine, that she'd driven in worse conditions, that her sister needed her. I'd heard this conversation before, of course. I'd lived it. It was the last conversation we'd ever had, conducted in the hallway of our apartment while she pulled on her coat, and I stood there in my pajamas, too annoyed to kiss her goodbye. The voices in room 217 played it exactly as it had happened, down to the final exchange. I'll be careful, I promise. Just call me when you get there, okay? I will. I love you. Love you too. And then silence. Not the usual abrupt cutoff, but a lingering, expectant quiet. As if the room itself was waiting for something that would never come. I stood in the hallway outside 217, tears streaming down, my face as the implications settled over me. These weren't random echoes or supernatural recordings. They were a chronological replay of our relationship, moving steadily toward its end. Which meant that eventually, inevitably, I would hear the phone call that came at 11:47 p.m., the one that shattered my world and left me hollow. The state trooper's voice professional but not unkind. Sir, I'm calling about Sarah Mitchell. She's been in an accident. I began to dread 317 in a way that was different from my earlier apprehension. The voices had become a countdown, a nightly step closer to the moment I least wanted to relive. But I couldn't stop listening. Despite the pain they caused, despite the way they reopened wounds I'd been trying to heal, the voices were the only connection I had left to Sarah. They were proof that our relationship had existed, that it had mattered, that the love we'd shared was real enough to leave echoes. In the world on Christmas Eve, the voices changed again. Instead of our usual conversations, I heard Sarah humming. It was a tune I recognized, something she'd often sung while cooking or cleaning, usually when she was particularly happy. The melody drifted through the door of 217 like a lullaby, gentle and familiar and heartbreaking. I opened the door and stepped inside. The humming continued, not from any particular direction, but from the room itself, as if the walls had learned the song and were singing it back. The floral scent was stronger than ever, and for a moment, just a moment, I could almost see her, a shimmer in the air by the window, a suggestion of movement in my peripheral vision. "Sarah," I whispered. The humming stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. A sound like breath, like someone trying to speak but unable to find the words. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I felt the familiar prickle of being watched. "I'm sorry," I said to the empty room. "I'm sorry I was angry. I'm sorry I didn't kiss you goodbye. I'm sorry I couldn't save you." The silence stretched on, but it felt different now. Not empty, but expectant. As if the room was waiting for something. "More, I miss you," I continued, "every day, every night. I miss your voice, your laugh, the way you made everything better just by being there. I don't know how to do this without you." A sound then, soft and barely audible. A sigh, perhaps, or the whisper of fabric against fabric. The digital clock on the nightstand flickered once, the numbers blurring for just an instant before returning to 3:28. I left the room and returned to my desk, but I couldn't concentrate on my work. Something had shifted in room 217, some fundamental change in the nature of whatever was happening there. I could feel it like a change in atmospheric pressure, subtle but unmistakable. The next night, the voices didn't come. I waited outside 217 from 3:15 to 3:30, but the hallway remained silent. The room felt different too, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from it. When I used my key to check inside, the floral scent was gone, replaced by the generic smell of hotel cleaning supplies and fresh linens. I told myself I was relieved. The voices had been a symptom of my grief, a psychological manifestation of my inability to let go. Their absence meant I was healing, moving forward, learning to live without Sarah in ways that were healthy rather than obsessive. But I wasn't relieved. I was devastated. For 4 months, room 217 had been my sanctuary, the one place where Sarah still existed. where our love still echoed in the world. Without the voices, I was truly alone in a way I hadn't been since the accident. The hotel's night shift, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a prison of silence and shadow. I requested a transfer to the day shift, but the manager explained that they needed someone reliable for nights. The Grandview's previous night auditor had quit suddenly, she said, claiming the building was haunted. She laughed as she said it, but I caught something in her expression that suggested she might not find it entirely amusing. "Did he mention any specific room?" I asked. "Room 217, actually. Said he heard voices, conversations. Can you imagine? As if a place this old doesn't have its share of settling noises and acoustic quirks." I nodded and returned to my work, but her words stayed with me. My predecessor had experienced the same thing, which meant the voices weren't unique to me. They weren't manifestations of my grief or psychological projections of my guilt. They were something else entirely, something that had existed before my arrival and would presumably continue after my departure. That night, I returned to 217 at 317, but the silence persisted. The room felt ordinary now, just another hotel room with its generic furnishings and sterile atmosphere. Whatever had been there was gone, leaving behind only the memory of voices and the lingering question of what they had meant. I worked at the Grandview for 3 more months before finally accepting a position at a smaller hotel across town. The new job paid less and offered fewer benefits, but it came with regular daytime hours and a staff room that actually felt alive with human activity. I convinced myself I was making a healthy choice, prioritizing my mental well-being over the comfort of familiar routines. On my last night at the Grandview, I made one final round of the building. The lobby was empty, the elevator silent, the hallways dimly lit by the vintage sconces that cast their familiar dancing shadows. When I reached the second floor, I paused outside room 217. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it during my earlier rounds, but old buildings settled and the door frames weren't always perfectly aligned. I pushed it open and stepped inside, intending to ensure everything was secure before I left. The room was exactly as I'd left it, but something felt different. Not the presence I'd grown accustomed to, but something subtler. A sense of completion, perhaps, or resolution. The air was still and quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I stood in the center of the room for several minutes, listening to the silence and thinking about the past 7 months. The voices had been real, regardless of their origin or explanation. They had brought me comfort and pain in equal measure, had forced me to confront my grief in ways I might otherwise have avoided. They had been a gift, perhaps, or a curse, or simply a mystery that I'd been privileged to witness. As I turned to leave, I heard it one last time. Sarah's laugh, faint but unmistakable, like an echo from a great distance. I stopped, my hand on the door handle, and listened. But the sound didn't repeat, and after a moment I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. "Goodbye," I whispered to the empty room. I closed the door behind me and walked away, leaving room 217 to its silence and whatever secrets it might hold for the next person who would listen carefully enough to hear them. 3 weeks later, I received a call from the Grandview's manager. They'd hired a new night auditor, she said, but he'd already put in a transfer request. He was complaining about noise in the building, voices in the walls, conversations that kept him awake. Specifically, he'd mentioned room 217. "I don't suppose you ever noticed anything unusual about that room?" she asked. I thought about the question for a long moment, remembering the voices, the familiar laughter, the conversations that had both tormented and comforted me through the darkest period of my life. "No," I said finally. "Nothing unusual at all. But as I hung up the phone, I found myself wondering about the new night auditor. What loss was he carrying? What voices was he hearing? And would room 217 offer him the same strange comfort it had provided me? Or would it simply drive him away as it had driven away so many others? The questions followed me into sleep, where I dreamed of conversations I'd never had and voices I'd never hear again, except in the whispered memories of a room that remembered everything and revealed its secrets only to those who needed them most. In the dream, Sarah was laughing and I was listening, and for 11 perfect minutes, we were together again in a place where time had no meaning, and love left echoes that never fully fade away. The house that breathed. I inherited my grandmother's house on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after her funeral and 2 days after I lost my job at the marketing firm. The timing felt like cosmic irony, or maybe cosmic mercy. I'd been dreading the conversation with my landlord about next month's rent, and suddenly I owned property in a town I hadn't visited since I was 12. Millbrook was the kind of place that looked better in childhood memories than in reality. The house sat on Elm Street, a narrow Victorian with peeling blue paint and a wraparound porch that sagged in places. It had good bones, the realtor had said when we discussed putting it on the market, but good bones don't pay for groceries or student loans. So I packed my life into the back of my Honda and drove 4 hours north to a house that smelled like lavender sachets and old wood. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, the aggressive quiet of a place that had been holding its breath for too long. Even my footsteps on the hardwood floors seemed muted, as if the house were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. Grandma Rose had lived alone here for the last 15 years, ever since Grandpa died. The rooms were filled with her things, doilies on every surface, china cats arranged on windowsills, photographs of relatives I barely remembered arranged in careful clusters on side tables. It felt like a museum of someone else's life. I set up my laptop in what had been her sewing room and tried to establish some kind of routine. Freelance web design wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me afloat while I figured out what to do with the house. The internet was surprisingly fast for such a small town, and the room had good natural light during the day. It was during my first week that I noticed the house's rhythm. At first I thought it was the furnace. Old houses make noises, settling, expanding, contracting with temperature changes. But this was different. There was a regularity to it, a gentle rise and fall that happened every few seconds. Like the house was breathing. I could feel it most clearly when I was lying in bed at night. The floorboards would creak softly in sequence, starting from somewhere deep in the house and moving outward, then reversing direction. The walls would make tiny popping sounds, barely audible but consistent. Even the windows seemed to flex slightly in their frames. During the day, distracted by work or the mundane tasks of settling in, I barely noticed it. But in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, the house's respiration became as obvious as my own heartbeat. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who'd been bringing me casseroles and local gossip. She was in her 70s, had lived next door for decades and knew everything about everyone in Millbrook. Oh, Rose always said the house breathed with her, Mrs. Chen said, arranging another foil-covered dish on my kitchen counter. Said it started after Edmund passed. Houses get lonely too, she used to say. I laughed politely, but something in Mrs. Chen's expression suggested she wasn't entirely joking. That night I paid closer attention to the rhythm. It was slow and deep, about 6 breaths per minute. I counted along with it for nearly an hour, and it never varied. When I held my own breath, the house continued its steady pattern. When I breathed faster, trying to match my rhythm to the house's, I just made myself dizzy. The breathing was most noticeable in Grandma Rose's old bedroom, the master bedroom I'd been avoiding since I arrived. It was exactly as she'd left it. Chenille bedspread smoothed carefully over the mattress, prescription bottles lined up on the nightstand, reading glasses folded next to a romance novel with a bookmark still marking her place. I'd been sleeping, in the guest room, telling myself it was more practical, but really I just couldn't bring myself to disturb her space. The bedroom felt too personal, too much like trespassing. But one night in my second week, insomnia drove me to wander the house. I found myself standing in the doorway of her room, listening to the breathing. In here, it was unmistakable. The floorboards rose and fell with each inhalation, so subtly that you had to be looking for it to notice. The curtains swayed slightly as if moved by an invisible breeze. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firmer than I expected, and it smelled faintly of the vanilla perfume Grandma Rose had always worn. As I sat there, I could feel the breathing all around me, in the walls, the floor, even the ceiling above my head. It should have been frightening. Instead, it was oddly comforting, like being held. I started spending more time in the room. I'd bring my laptop in during the day and work from the old rocking chair by the window. The breathing never stopped, but it seemed to adjust to my presence. When I was focused on a project, it would slow down, becoming almost subliminal. When I was stressed or frustrated, it would deepen, becoming more noticeable, more soothing. One afternoon, while researching a client's website, I found myself unconsciously matching my breathing to the house's rhythm. It was incredibly relaxing. My shoulders unclenched, my jaw loosened, and the tension headache I'd been fighting all day simply dissolved. That night, I moved my things into Grandma Rose's room. The change was immediate. I slept better than I had in months, waking up refreshed instead of groggy. My work improved. I felt calmer, more centered. The house's breathing had become a kind of meditation, a constant reminder to slow down and be present. But it wasn't until I found the journal that I understood what was really happening. I was cleaning out the closet, finally ready to deal with Grandma Rose's clothes, when I discovered a small wooden box hidden behind her winter coats. Inside were letters, old photographs, and a leather-bound journal with entries dating back 15 years. The first entry was from the week after Grandpa Edmund's funeral. The house feels so empty without him. I keep expecting to hear his footsteps in the hall, his cough from the living room. But there's only silence, and it's deafening. I don't know how to live in this quiet. The entries over the following months chronicled her grief, her struggle with loneliness, her gradual adaptation to life alone. But then about 6 months after Edmund's death, the tone changed. Something strange happened today. I was sitting in our bedroom, missing Edmund terribly, when I noticed the floorboards creaking in a pattern, not random settling, but rhythmic, like breathing. It reminded me of how Edmund used to breathe when he was sleeping, slow and deep and steady. I found myself breathing along with it, and for the first time since he died, I felt peaceful. The entries that followed documented her growing awareness of the house's breathing. She wrote about how it comforted her during difficult nights, how it seemed to respond to her moods, how it made her feel less alone. I think the house learned to breathe from Edmund and me, she wrote in an entry from 2 years ago. 53 years of sleeping in the same room, breathing the same air, our lives so intertwined that even the walls absorbed our rhythm. Now that he's gone, the house remembers for both of us. The final entry was dated just a week before she died. I've been breathing with this house for 15 years now, and I realize it's been breathing with me too. When I'm gone, I wonder if it will remember my rhythm the way it remembered Edmund's. I hope whoever comes after will understand that. This house isn't haunted, it's loved. There's a difference. I closed the journal and sat in the rocking chair, listening to the house breathe around me. 6 breaths per minute, the exact rate of deep, restful sleep. The rhythm of 2 people who'd shared a bed for over half a century, whose breathing had synchronized so completely that it had become part of the house itself. That night I lay in Grandma Rose's bed and let myself sink into the house's rhythm. I breathed with it, matching my inhalations and exhalations to the gentle rise and fall of the floorboards. And as I drifted off to sleep, I could swear I felt other rhythms joining in, faster and slower, overlapping and harmonizing. 3 generations of my family, all breathing together in the place they'd called home. I never did put the house on the market. I couldn't sell something that was still alive, still loving, still remembering everyone who'd ever drawn breath within its walls. Sometimes late at night I talked to the house the way Grandma Rose used to talk to Grandpa Edmund's empty chair. I tell it about my day, my worries, my small triumphs. And the house listens, its breathing adjusting to my voice, reminding me that I'm not alone. The house breathes, and now I breathe with it. And someday, when I'm gone, maybe it will remember my rhythm too, adding it to the symphony of all the people who found peace within these walls. Mrs. Chen was right. Houses do get lonely, but they also know how to love, how to hold on to the best parts of the people who made them home. This house learned to breathe from love, and it's been sharing that breath ever since, one gentle inhalation at a time. Locked in with the past. The storage unit had been sitting untouched for 18 months when I finally worked up the courage to deal with it. Mom's death hadn't been sudden. Cancer rarely is. But somehow I'd still felt unprepared for the aftermath. The funeral arrangements, the estate paperwork, the endless decisions about what to keep and what to let go. Her house had been manageable. I'd spent 2 weeks sorting through decades of accumulated life, keeping the meaningful pieces and donating the rest. But the storage unit was different. It held the things she deemed too important to discard but too painful to keep in daily view. The monthly bill arrived like clockwork, $89 deducted automatically from the account I'd inherited along with everything else. For over a year I'd told myself I'd get to it eventually when I felt ready, when I had time. But readiness never came, and time stretched endlessly forward, carrying that small financial reminder of unfinished business. The facility sat on the outskirts of town, one of those sprawling complexes of beige, metal buildings that had sprouted up in the early 2000s. Castle Self-Storage, according to the faded sign by the entrance. The irony wasn't lost on me. There was nothing castle-like about the rows of identical roll-up doors, each hiding someone's overflow life behind corrugated steel. Unit 47B was tucked into the back corner of Building C, isolated from the main thoroughfare where most customers loaded and unloaded their belongings. I'd been here only once before, 3 years ago when Mom had asked me to help her move some boxes from the house. She'd seemed nervous that day, almost secretive about what we were storing, but I'd attributed it to the general emotional weight of downsizing a lifetime's worth of possessions. The key turned easily in the padlock, though my hands trembled slightly as I rolled up the metal door. The mechanical grinding echoed in the empty corridor behind me, a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet Saturday afternoon. Sunlight flooded into the 10 by 12 space, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The unit was packed, floor to ceiling with boxes, furniture draped in moving blankets, and the accumulated detritus of a life lived fully. But it was organized. Mom had always been meticulous about organization, with everything labeled in her careful handwriting and arranged with obvious intention. I'd brought a flashlight, work gloves, and a mental plan to tackle everything systematically. Start with the boxes near the door, sort items into keep, donate, and discard piles, work my way toward the back. Simple, manageable. The kind of practical approach Mom would have approved of. The first few boxes contained what I'd expected. Holiday. Decorations, old photo albums, books she'd loved but no longer had room to display. I found myself getting lost in the photographs. Mom as a young woman, impossibly glamorous in black and white. Family vacations I'd forgotten. My own awkward progression through adolescence. The work went slowly, each item triggering its own small meditation on memory and loss. It was when I reached for a box labeled Michael's Things that I noticed the door. At the very back of the unit, partially hidden behind a cupboard armoire, was what looked like another door. Not the roll-up entrance I'd come through, but a traditional hinged door painted the same institutional beige as the walls. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. I set down the box and made my way through the maze of stored belongings, moving blankets and shifting furniture to get a better look. The door was definitely real, though it made no sense. Storage units were supposed to be completely enclosed, sealed boxes with single points of access. There was no reason for a door to lead anywhere except into another unit, and I was certain 47B shared walls with the building's exterior on two sides. The door frame looked newer than the rest of the structure. The paint slightly different in shade and texture. Someone had installed this after the original construction, though why or when remained unclear. I pulled out my phone to use as additional light and examined the area more carefully. The door handle was old-fashioned, brass worn smooth by countless hands. There was no lock, no keyhole, just a simple latch mechanism that looked like it belonged in a house rather than a commercial storage facility. I pressed my ear to the gap and listened, but heard nothing beyond the typical sounds of a large building settling. Distant footsteps, the hum of climate control systems, the occasional slam of a unit door elsewhere in the complex. I should have left it alone. Should have focused on the task at hand. Finished sorting through Mom's things and ignored the architectural anomaly that had nothing to do with why I was there. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the door seemed to pulse with possibility. In the dim light of the storage unit, I pushed it open. The space beyond was smaller than the storage unit, perhaps 8 feet square, with concrete walls and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled stale and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. But what captured my attention wasn't the room itself. It was the contents. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows like a gallery exhibition. Most were black and white, though some were in the faded color of older film processing. They showed people I didn't recognize. Families gathered around dinner tables, children playing in suburban yards, couples posing for anniversary portraits. Ordinary moments from ordinary lives, captured and preserved with obvious care. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, the kind you might find in a 1950s kitchen, painted yellow and worn smooth by use. Beside it was a small table, holding a shoebox and what looked like a magnifying glass. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft click. The sound made me turn, and I was surprised to find that there was no handle on this side of the door, just smooth wood painted the same beige as everything else. For a moment, panic fluttered in my chest, but when I pushed against the door, it opened easily. The handle mechanism worked from either side. It just wasn't visible from within the room. The photographs drew me back. As I looked more closely, I began to notice patterns. Many of the images featured the same locations: a particular park, a specific church, the interior of what might have been a school or community center. The people varied, but the settings repeated as if someone had been documenting the same places over many years, capturing different groups who had passed through them. I picked up the magnifying glass and examined some of the photos more carefully. The quality was excellent, professional-level work with careful attention to lighting and composition. These weren't casual snapshots but deliberate portraits, each one capturing something essential about its subjects. A woman's proud smile as she held a baby, a group of men in work clothes, arms around each other's shoulders, children in Halloween costumes, grinning gap-toothed grins at the camera. The shoebox contained more photographs, these ones loose rather than mounted on the walls. I sifted through them slowly, noting the same careful composition and attention to detail. But as I went deeper into the box, I began to recognize faces. There was Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, looking decades younger, but unmistakably herself. Mr. Kowalski from the grocery store where I'd worked as a teenager, standing behind a different counter in what must have been his previous job. My high school math teacher, Mrs. Chen, wearing a wedding dress and beaming at a man I'd never seen before. And there, near the bottom of the box, was my mother. She couldn't have been more than 25, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the early 1980s, wearing a sundress I remembered from my childhood. She was standing in front of our old house, the one we'd lived in before Dad left, the one she'd sold when I was 12. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera, with the easy intimacy of a couple in love. My hands were shaking as I held the photograph. Mom had never mentioned anyone between Dad and the brief relationship she'd had with Robert, the accountant who'd lasted 2 years when I was in high school. She'd always said she was too busy raising me to think about romance, too focused on building a stable life after Dad's departure to complicate things with new relationships. But here was proof of something else entirely. A relationship significant, enough to be photographed, intimate enough to be preserved, hidden enough that I'd never heard a word about it. I set the photo aside and continued searching through the box. There were more images of my mother, spanning what looked like several years. The mystery man appeared in about half of them, and in the others, she was alone but radiating a happiness I remembered from my earliest childhood, before Dad's drinking. Got bad before the fight started, before everything fell apart. At the very bottom of the box, I found a letter. The envelope was addressed to Emma in handwriting I didn't recognize. There was no return address, no postmark, just Mom's name, written in careful script across cream-colored paper. Inside was a single sheet covered in the same handwriting. Emma, I know you said we couldn't see each other anymore, and I understand why. Tommy needs stability, and I'm not the kind of man who can give you that. My work takes me too many places, keeps me away too long. You deserve someone who can be there, every night, who can help you build the life you want for yourself and your son. But I want you to know that these past 2 years have been the happiest of my life. I've never felt as at home anywhere as I did in your kitchen on Sunday mornings, reading the paper while you made pancakes and Tommy built cities with his blocks on the floor. I thought maybe I'd found the thing I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. I won't contact you again. I promise. But I'm leaving this box of photographs because I want you to remember that what we had was real. Not just the two of us, but all of it. The whole community of people whose lives intersected with ours. Everyone in these pictures was part of something larger, something that mattered even if it couldn't last. Take care of yourself, Emma. Take care of Tommy. And if you ever change your mind about what kind of stability you need, you know how to find me. Love always. David, I read the letter 3 times before setting it down with trembling hands. David, a name I'd never heard, connected to a period of my mother's life I'd never known existed. The timeline fit. I would have been 7 or 8, old enough to remember another adult in our lives if he'd been a regular presence. But my memories of that time were vague, filtered through the self-absorption of childhood, and later overshadowed by the trauma of my parents' divorce. I picked up the photograph of Mom and David again, studying their faces with new understanding. They looked genuinely happy, comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of real intimacy. Not the desperate clinging of people afraid to be alone, but the easy connection of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Why had she never told me about him? Why had she hidden this entire relationship? These photographs, this evidence of what had apparently been a significant period of her life. The answer came as I looked around the small room again, taking in the careful arrangement of photographs on the walls. This wasn't just a storage space, it was a shrine, a place where Mom had preserved not just her relationship with David, but the entire community of people who had been part of that time in her life. The neighbors, the local business owners, the families who had shared that brief period of happiness before everything changed. I understood now why the door had been installed, why this room had been hidden behind the more conventional storage. This wasn't about decluttering or downsizing. This was about preserving something too precious to throw away, but too painful to live with every day. I spent the next hour examining the photographs on the walls, trying to piece together the story they told. The images seemed to span about 3 years, from the late 1970s through the early 1980s. They documented birthday parties, community events, casual gatherings, the fabric of a close-knit neighborhood where people knew each other's children and celebrated each other's milestones. In many of the photos, I could see David in the background or standing with various groups. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and an easy smile that reached his eyes. He looked like someone who belonged wherever he was, comfortable with both intimate family moments and larger social gatherings. The kind of man who would remember everyone's name and ask about their jobs, their kids, their dreams. I found myself wondering what my life would have been like if he'd stayed, if Mom had chosen differently, if the stability she'd thought I needed had been found with him rather than in the careful isolation she'd maintained for most of my childhood. Would I have grown up with a father figure who was present and engaged? Would Mom have been happier, more relaxed, less burdened by the weight of single parenthood? The questions were pointless, of course. The past was fixed, unchangeable, and Mom had made her decisions based on what she thought was best for both of us. But standing in that small room surrounded by evidence of a life path not taken, I couldn't help but feel the weight of all the might-have-beens. I was studying a photograph of what looked like a neighborhood barbecue when I heard the sound. It was subtle at first, just a faint creaking like an old house settling, but as I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from above. Footsteps in the room overhead, though I was certain the storage facility was single-story. The footsteps had a deliberate quality, as if someone was pacing back and forth, thinking through a problem or waiting for something to happen. I looked up at the ceiling, but there was nothing to see except the bare concrete and the single bulb that cast harsh shadows in every direction. The footsteps continued, steady and rhythmic, punctuated occasionally by what sounded like furniture being moved. A chair scraped across the floor, a door opening and closing, the soft thud of something being set down. The sounds were domestic, familiar. The kind of background noise you'd expect from an apartment overhead, except there was no apartment overhead. Just the roof of the storage facility and the parking lot beyond. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Perhaps there was maintenance being done on the building, workers on the roof or in some space I wasn't aware of. But the sounds were too regular, too purposeful, too much like someone living their daily life in a space that couldn't exist. The footsteps stopped directly above where I was standing, In the silence that followed, I could hear what sounded like papers rustling, as if someone was looking through documents or letters. Then, faintly, came the sound of crying, not the sharp grief of sudden loss, but the quiet, steady weeping of someone processing long-held pain. I stood perfectly still, hardly breathing as the crying continued overhead. It was a woman's voice, and something about the timbre and rhythm felt familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. The sound filled me with an inexplicable sadness, as if I was witnessing someone else's private moment of sorrow and understanding exactly what they were feeling. After several minutes, the crying stopped, replaced by the sound of movement again. Footsteps crossing the room, a door opening, then silence. I waited another 10 minutes, but the sounds didn't return. Whatever I'd heard, maintenance work, acoustic anomalies, or something else entirely, had ended, leaving me alone in the small room with the photographs and the growing sense that I was trespassing on something more significant than a storage space. I gathered up the loose photographs and the letter, unsure what to do with them but unwilling to leave them behind. As I moved toward the door, my flashlight beam caught something I'd missed earlier. Writing on the back wall, barely visible, in the dim light. It was carved directly into the concrete, as if someone had used a nail or sharp tool to scratch letters into the surface. The words were difficult to make out, but as I traced them with my fingertip, they became clear. For Emma, who taught me that home isn't a place, it's the people who know your story and love you anyway. D.I. stood there for a long time, reading and rereading those words, trying to understand what they meant and why David had felt compelled to carve them into the wall of this hidden room. It felt like a message left for someone who might never see it, a declaration of love preserved in concrete and shadow. When I finally opened the door to leave, I was surprised to find that the storage unit beyond looked different. Not dramatically. The boxes were still stacked in neat rows, the furniture still draped in moving blankets. But something about the light seemed changed, softer somehow, as if filtered through something I couldn't see. I made my way back to the entrance, carrying the photographs and letter, and was startled to find that the sun had nearly set. According to my phone, I'd been in the storage unit for over 4 hours, though it felt like I'd been in the small room for no more than one. Time had stretched and compressed in ways that made no logical sense, leaving me disoriented and slightly nauseous. I loaded the photographs into my car and drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd discovered. Mom had lived an entire life I'd never known about, had loved someone she'd never mentioned, had made sacrifices I'd never understood. The woman who had raised me, careful, cautious, sometimes distant, had once been part of something vibrant and connected, part of a community that had valued and documented every moment of ordinary joy. That night, I spread the photographs across my kitchen table and studied them by lamplight. The faces looked back at me from across the decades, frozen in moments of celebration and connection that felt both foreign and familiar. I found myself searching for clues about who these people had been, what had brought them together, what had eventually pulled them apart. In several of the photos, I noticed the same location appearing repeatedly, a small house with a distinctive front porch painted white with blue trim. The house appeared in family portraits, casual gatherings, and what looked like holiday celebrations. It seemed to be a central meeting place for the community, somewhere people felt comfortable bringing their children and sharing their important moments. I recognized the house from my childhood. It belonged to Mrs. Martinez, an elderly woman who had lived at the end of our street when I was growing up. She'd been kind to me in the distracted way of adults who had their own preoccupations, always offering candy from a bowl by her front door and asking polite questions about school. I'd never thought much about her history, but seeing her house featured so prominently in these photographs made me realize she'd been central to something I'd never been aware of. Mrs. Martinez had died about 5 years ago, I remembered. Her house had been sold to a young couple who'd renovated extensively, erasing most traces of its previous character. But in these photographs, it was alive with activity, filled with people who clearly considered it a second home. I spent most of the night going through the photographs, trying to piece together the relationships and connections that had shaped this community Mom had been part of. The more I studied the images, the more I began to understand what I was looking at. Not just random social gatherings, but a chosen family of people who had supported each other through the ordinary challenges of life. There were photographs of baby showers and birthday parties, graduation celebrations, and anniversary dinners. I saw the same faces appearing across multiple events, aging slightly from photo to photo, their children growing up and starting families of their own. It was a record of a functioning community, the kind of interconnected social network that seemed to barely exist anymore. And David was woven throughout it all, not as an outsider or newcomer, but as someone who clearly belonged, who had found his place among these people and contributed to their collective life. In the photographs, he was helping to move furniture, cooking at community barbecues, playing with children who weren't his own. He looked like someone who understood that happiness came from connection, from being part of something larger than yourself. The next day, I returned to the storage unit. I told myself I needed to finish sorting through Mom's things, but in reality, I wanted to spend more time in the small room, to see if I could understand more about what it meant and why it had been preserved. The door to the room was closed when I arrived, though I was certain I'd left it ajar. When I opened it, I found that everything was exactly as I'd left it the day before, but the quality of light seemed different again, more golden, as if the bare bulb had been replaced with something warmer. I sat in the yellow chair and looked at the photographs on the walls with fresh eyes. Now that I understood more about the community they represented, I could see patterns I'd missed before. The way certain people always stood together, suggesting close friendships or family relationships. The evolution of hairstyles and clothing that marked the passage of time. The gradual introduction of new faces as families grew and moved in, and the corresponding absence of others as people moved away or passed on. It was like looking at a visual history of a place and time that had existed, flourished, and eventually faded, leaving behind only these carefully preserved images and the memories of those who had been part of it. I was examining a photograph of what looked like a Christmas party when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they seemed closer, as if the person overhead was standing directly above me. The sound of papers rustling returned, and I found myself holding my breath, listening with the desperate attention of someone trying to decode a message in a language they didn't speak. Then, clearly and unmistakably, I heard my mother's voice. "I should have told him," she said, her words carrying clearly through whatever space separated us. "I should have explained why I couldn't, why it had to be this way," another voice responded, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a man speaking in the gentle, reassuring tones of someone trying to comfort a person in distress. "He thinks I didn't trust him enough to share this," Mom continued. "But it wasn't about trust. It was about God. How do you explain to your adult child that you once had a chance at happiness and chose to give it up because you were afraid? How do you tell them that you spent 30 years wondering if you made the right choice?" My hands were gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. I was hearing my mother's voice, clear and immediate. discussing me and the discoveries I'd made in this room. But Mom had been dead for 18 months. Whatever I was hearing couldn't be real, couldn't be happening, couldn't be anything more than my grief-stricken mind creating the conversations I wished we could have had. "He found the photographs," she said. "He read David's letter. He knows about all of it now, and I'm not there to explain. I'm not there to tell him that I loved David, really loved him, but I loved my son more. I loved him enough to choose stability over passion, security over romance, the known over the unknown." The male voice responded again, and this time I caught fragments. "Would have understood, and, still could." "No," Mom said firmly. "It's too late for that. David's been gone for years now. Heart attack 3 years ago. I saw the obituary in the paper. And Tommy spent his whole life thinking I sacrificed everything for him. And now he's going to think I sacrificed his chance at having a real father figure because I was too scared to take a risk." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the concrete floor. The sound seemed to echo strangely in the small space, and the voices overhead stopped mid-conversation. "Mom?" I called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. "Mom, is that you?" Silence. Then so faintly I might have imagined it, I heard what sounded like footsteps moving away, growing more distant until they faded entirely. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the storage unit, but I didn't hear the voices again. When I finally left, I took the letter with me, along with the photograph of Mom and David. Everything else I left exactly as I'd found it, understanding somehow that the small room needed to remain intact, preserved as a monument to choices made and paths not taken. That evening I did something I hadn't done since Mom's funeral. I called my Aunt Linda, Mom's younger sister, who lived in Phoenix and had always been more forthcoming about family history than Mom had ever been. "Linda," I said when she answered, "I need to ask you about something. Did Mom was there ever someone named David in her life? After Dad left, but before she stopped dating entirely?" The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Oh, honey," Linda finally said, her voice soft with recognition and something that might have been regret. "You found something, didn't you? Something she kept hidden?" I told her about the storage unit, the small room, the photographs and letter. As I spoke, I could hear Linda taking deep breaths, as if preparing for a conversation she'd been avoiding for decades. "Your mother loved that man," she said when I finished. "I mean really loved him, in a way I never saw with your father or anyone else. He was everything she'd ever wanted in a partner. Kind, reliable, crazy about both of you. He would have made a wonderful stepfather." "Then why?" I asked. "Why did she end it?" "Because she was terrified," Linda said simply. "Your father had left such a mess behind. The drinking, the financial problems, the way he'd made promises he couldn't keep. Your mom was just starting to get back on her feet, and David's job required a lot of travel. She was afraid that if she let herself depend on him and then he left, or if his work took him away permanently, she'd be back where she started. Only this time, you'd be the one who got hurt. But he loved her, the letter. Oh, he loved her absolutely. And he loved you too, which was maybe the hardest part for Emma to handle. You were so young and you'd already been through so much with your father leaving. She couldn't bear the thought of you getting attached to another father figure who might not be able to stay. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the photographs I'd brought home, trying to process this new understanding of my mother's choices. She hadn't been afraid of love. She'd been afraid of loss, afraid of putting me through another abandonment, another disappointment, another lesson in the unreliability of the adults who were supposed to provide stability. Did she ever regret it? I asked. Linda was quiet for a long moment. She never said so directly, she finally answered. But every few years she'd mention something about David. She'd seen his name in some professional journal, or heard from someone that he'd moved to a new city, or read about some project he was working on. She kept track of him, honey. She never stopped caring. After I hung up, I sat with the photographs spread across my table and thought about the conversation I'd overheard in the storage room. Whether it had been real or imagined, it had revealed a truth I needed to understand. Mom's decision to end her relationship with David hadn't been about fear of commitment or inability to love. It had been about prioritizing my well-being over her own happiness, choosing what she believed was best for me even when it cost her the relationship that had brought her the most joy. I thought about the sacrifices parents make, the impossible choices between competing forms of love, the way good intentions can sometimes create the very wounds they're meant to prevent. Mom had protected me from the possibility of another loss, but in doing so, she'd also deprived both of us of the possibility of something beautiful. The next weekend, I returned to the storage unit one last time. I spent the day properly sorting through Mom's belongings, keeping what mattered and preparing the rest for donation. But I left the small room exactly as I'd found it, understanding that it represented something too important to disturb. As I was preparing to leave, I noticed that the door to the room was standing open, revealing the photographs on the walls and the yellow chair in the center. The late afternoon light streaming through the storage unit's entrance cast long shadows across the space, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw two figures standing together by the chair, a woman with dark hair and a tall man with kind eyes, their hands almost touching as they looked at the photographs surrounding them. I blinked and the figures were gone, leaving only light and shadow and the preserved evidence of a love story that had been too precious to forget and too painful to remember. I closed the storage unit for the last time and drove away, carrying with me a new understanding of my mother's life and the choices she'd made. The monthly bill would continue to arrive, and I would continue to pay it, understanding now that some things are worth preserving even when they can't be fully understood. In my dreams that night, I heard voices from the small room, not the conversation I'd overheard, but something new. My mother's voice, clear and peaceful, telling David about the man I'd become, about the life she'd built for us after he'd gone, and David's voice responding with the patience and kindness I'd glimpsed in his letter, understanding without judgment, loving without condition, accepting the choices that had been made and the reasons behind them. When I woke, I found myself thinking about the photograph of Mom and David standing in front of our old house, both of them smiling with the unconscious joy of people who believed they had all the time in the world. They'd been wrong about that, of course. Time had run out sooner than expected, choices had been made that couldn't be unmade, and love had been sacrificed to fear. But in that small hidden room behind the storage unit, surrounded by images of the community they'd been part of and the life they'd briefly shared, something had been preserved, not just the memory of what had been, but the understanding that some kinds of love transcend time and space and the limitations of human decision-making. The past was locked away, carefully curated and maintained, but it wasn't gone. It lived, on in photographs and letters, in voices heard through impossible ceilings, in the knowledge that every choice creates its own form of loss and preservation. And somewhere in that knowledge, I found a peace I hadn't expected, not the resolution of all questions, but the acceptance that some mysteries are meant to be lived rather than solved. Some rooms are meant to be discovered rather than explained. and some forms of love are strong enough to survive even the choices that seemed to end them. The apartment. That remembers I never believed in haunted places. Not really. Not in the way people talk about them. Whispers in the dark, cold spots, doors slamming shut on their own. Those things always felt like stories, exaggerations, the kind of fear that lives in the imagination rather than the walls. But then I moved into apartment 4B. It was a steal, too good to be true, really. A one-bedroom in the heart of the city, with tall windows that let in soft golden light in the afternoons. The hardwood floors creaked in a way that felt comforting. Lived in. The landlord, a quiet man with tired eyes, handed me the keys without ceremony. "It's been empty a while," he said, "but it's a good place." I should have asked why it had been empty. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked. My books, arranged my furniture, settled into the rhythm of a new home. But then, on the fourth night, I woke to the sound of whispering. Not from the hallway, not from the street below, from the walls. It wasn't loud, just a murmur like someone speaking softly in another room. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Intimate, urgent, like a secret being shared. I told myself it was the pipes, the wind, my imagination. But then I started noticing other things. The way the air would grow thick in certain corners, as if resisting me. The faint scent of lavender in the bathroom, a smell I never brought in. And the dreams, God, the dreams. I'd wake with fragments clinging to me, images of a woman with dark hair standing in the kitchen humming, a child's laughter echoing down the hall, a hand brushing against my shoulder as I slept. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, loneliness, the residue of past tenants. But then, one evening I found the writing. It was inside the closet, scrawled in pencil on the back wall. Tiny, cramped letters, like someone had written it in a hurry. It remembers. It remembers everything. I ran my fingers over the words. The graphite smudged under my touch, fresh. That was when I realized the apartment wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memory, and it was starting to remember me. Beneath. The floorboards, I never meant to buy the house on Maple Street. It wasn't the kind of place I'd imagined myself living. A narrow Victorian wedged between two modern constructions. Its paint peeling like old scabs. Its front porch sagging under the weight of decades. But after the divorce, after Sarah took half of everything and left me with a credit score that made landlords wince, it was all I could afford. The realtor, a woman with tired eyes and coffee breath, had walked me through the rooms with the enthusiasm of someone describing a funeral. "It's got character," she'd said, gesturing at the warped hardwood floors and the wallpaper that curled at the edges like dying leaves. "And it's in your price range." That last part was what mattered. The house was cheap because it had been empty. For 3 years, ever since the previous owner, an elderly man named Harold Griggs, had died alone in the upstairs bedroom. Natural causes, the realtor assured me, though she couldn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. I moved in on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air held that crisp promise of winter. The house felt larger. When empty, my footsteps echoing through rooms that seemed to swallow sound. I'd sold most of my furniture in the divorce settlement, so I made do with an air mattress in the living room and a folding chair I'd salvaged from my old office. The first few nights were quiet. I'd lie on the air mattress listening to the house settle around me, the familiar groans and sighs that old buildings make as they adjust to the temperature changes. I told myself it was normal, that every house had its sounds. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A rhythm beneath the random creaks and pops like a heartbeat deep in the walls. It was during the second week that I first noticed the smell. I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when it hit me. A sweet, cloying odor that made my stomach turn. I checked the refrigerator, thinking maybe the previous owner had left something behind, but it was empty and clean. I searched through the cabinets looking for a dead mouse or some forgotten food, but found nothing. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, stronger in some rooms than others. It was worst in the living room where I'd been sleeping and almost non-existent upstairs. I bought air fresheners, opened windows, even called a plumber to check for sewer problems. Nothing helped. Old houses smell, my brother Mike said when I called him. It's probably just mold or something. You should have bought a condo. But I knew the difference between mold and decay, between mustiness and something else entirely. This smell was organic, almost floral, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. It clung to my clothes, followed me to work, invaded my dreams. It was the smell that led me to the floorboards. I was lying on the air mattress one night, trying to ignore the odor that seemed particularly strong, when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound like fingernails on wood. I sat up listening, but the sound stopped. Then it started again, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere below me. I got up and walked across the living room floor, testing each board with my weight. Most of them creaked in the normal way, but there was one section near the far wall that felt different. The boards there were loose, giving slightly under pressure, and when I knelt down and pressed my ear to the floor, I could hear something. A faint rustling, like paper being shuffled. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought a crowbar. The floorboards came up easier than I'd expected, as if they'd been loosened before. Underneath was a space about 3 feet wide and maybe 18 inches deep, carved out of the subfloor and the earth beneath. It was too dark to see much, so I got a flashlight and aimed it into the gap. What I saw made my hands shake. The space was filled with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered like leaves across the dirt floor. They were old, the kind with white borders and that slightly faded look of pictures from decades past. I reached down and picked up a handful, my fingers trembling as I examined them in the flashlight beam. They were all of the same woman. She was young in the earliest photos, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read. The photos showed her in different settings, sitting on a park bench, walking down a street, eating at a restaurant. They had the quality of surveillance photos, taken from a distance without the subject's knowledge. As I sorted through them, I could see her aging, the dark hair gradually showing streaks of gray, the face developing lines, the body growing thicker. Whoever had taken these photos had been documenting this woman's life for years, maybe decades. At the bottom of the pile, I found the most recent ones. The woman was elderly now, her hair white, her face deeply lined, but it was still unmistakably the same person. In these photos, she was in what looked like a hospital bed, then a nursing home, then the last photo showed her in a coffin. I dropped the pictures and scrambled back from the hole, my heart pounding. The smell was stronger now, rising from the space beneath the floorboards like invisible smoke. I looked at the photos scattered around me, at the woman's face repeated hundreds of times, and I understood with a clarity that made my skin crawl. Harold Griggs, the previous owner, had been obsessed with this woman. He'd stalked her, photographed her, documented her entire life from a distance. And when she died, he'd kept the evidence of his obsession hidden beneath his floor. I should have called the police. I should have gathered up the photos and turned them over to the authorities, let them sort out what Harold Griggs had done. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the expression in the woman's eyes, even in those early photos where she couldn't have known she was being watched. There was a sadness there, a loneliness that I recognized. Instead, I put the floorboards back. That night, I dreamed of her. She was standing at the foot of my air mattress, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her face was as I'd seen it in the middle photos, middle-aged, tired, but still beautiful. She didn't speak, just stood there watching me with those dark eyes. When I woke up, the smell was gone. For a few days, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare brought on by my discovery. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from it. I even started thinking about buying some real furniture, maybe staying in the house longer than I'd originally planned. But the dreams continued. Every night, she would appear at the foot of my makeshift bed, always in that white dress, always watching. Sometimes she looked young, sometimes old, but always with that same expression of profound sadness. I began to look forward to seeing her, strange as that sounds. In my waking life, I was alone, isolated in a house that felt too big and too empty. But in my dreams, I had company. It was during the third week that I realized the dreams weren't dreams at all. I woke up one night to find her standing there, just as she had been in my sleep. But this time, I was definitely awake. I could feel the cool air from the window, could hear the distant sound of traffic on the main road, and there she was, translucent but unmistakably present, her dark eyes fixed on mine. "You found them," she said, and her voice was like wind through dry leaves. I tried to speak but couldn't. My throat felt closed, my tongue thick and useless. "Watched me," she continued, her form flickering slightly like a candle flame in a breeze. "For 40 years he watched me. Every day, every milestone, every moment of joy and sorrow, he was there, always there, taking his pictures." I managed to find my voice. "Who was he to you?" She smiled then, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. "Nobody. A stranger who decided my life belonged to him. I never knew his name until after I died, when I found myself here. Here? Trapped. Bound to this place by his obsession, by those photographs. Every picture he took was a piece of my soul, and he kept them all, hoarded them like treasure." I thought about the photos beneath the floorboards, hundreds of stolen moments, a life documented without consent. "What do you want from me? Help me," she whispered, and her form was growing fainter. "Burn them, all of them, let me go." The next morning, I pried up the floorboards again. The photos were still there, scattered in the dirt like fallen leaves. I gathered them up, every single one, and carried them outside to the backyard. I built a fire in an old metal trash can I found in the garage, and one by one I fed the photographs to the flames. As each picture burned, I felt something shift in the air around me. The house seemed to exhale, releasing a breath it had been holding for years. When the last photo turned to ash, I heard something that might have been a sigh, or maybe just the wind. That night, she appeared one final time. But now she looked different, younger, happier, the sadness gone from her eyes. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was warm, like sunlight on water. "I can go now." "Wait," I called out, but she was already fading. "What was your name?" "Eleanor," she said, and then she was gone. I never saw her again. The house felt normal after that, just an old Victorian with creaky floors and peeling paint. I bought furniture, hung pictures on the walls, made it into a home. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows through the trees outside, I think I can hear her voice carried on the breeze, whispering a word that sounds like free. I still live in the house on Maple Street. It's been 2 years now, and I've never regretted my decision to help Eleanor find peace. But sometimes I wonder about Harold Griggs, about what drove him to such obsession, such violation of another person's life. I wonder if he's trapped somewhere too, bound by his own guilt and shame. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps upstairs in the bedroom where he died. Slow, shuffling steps that pace back and forth, as if someone is walking, the floor unable to rest. I've never gone up to investigate. Some secrets are better left buried, some ghosts better left alone. Eleanor earned her freedom through suffering. Harold Griggs. Well, maybe he's getting exactly what he deserves. The floorboards in the living room are solid now, nailed down tight, but sometimes when the house is very quiet, I still think I can hear something stirring beneath them. Not photos this time, I made sure of that. But something else. Something that rustles and scratches and whispers in the dark. I don't plan to look. Some things are better left beneath the floorboards where they belong. The apartment that remembers. The keys felt heavier than they should have in my palm as I stood before apartment 4B, rain drumming against the hallway window behind me. 3 months of searching, countless rejections, and dwindling savings had led me here, to this rent-controlled studio in a building that seemed to exist in a different decade entirely. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been almost eager to hand over the lease, her weathered fingers trembling slightly as she passed me the brass keys. Previous tenant left suddenly, she'd explained, avoiding my eyes. Everything's still there, furniture, dishes, books. She said you could keep whatever you wanted. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why someone would abandon a fully furnished apartment in this market, leaving behind what looked like an entire life. But desperation has a way of silencing curiosity, and I was desperate. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it remembered being opened. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space that felt immediately, inexplicably familiar. Afternoon light filtered through gauze curtains, casting everything in a golden haze that reminded me of childhood summers I couldn't quite place. The air smelled of lavender and old books with an underlying sweetness that made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. The apartment was small but perfectly arranged. A Murphy bed folded neatly into the wall, revealing a living area, with a velvet armchair positioned to catch the light from the single window. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that seemed to have been collected over decades. In the kitchenette, mismatched but charming dishes waited in the cupboards, and herbs grew in small pots on the windowsill, somehow still green despite having been abandoned. I set my single suitcase down and walked to the window. 4 stories below, the street seemed muted, as if the glass filtered out more than just sound. People moved with purpose along the sidewalk, but from up here, they looked like figures in a snow globe, present but separate, part of a world I was no longer fully connected to. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The bed, when I pulled it down from the wall, was perfectly made with sheets that smelled faintly of the same lavender that permeated the air. I'd expected the usual discomfort of sleeping in a stranger's space, but instead felt wrapped in something approaching peace. My dreams were vivid but pleasant, memories of places I'd never been, conversations with people whose faces I couldn't quite recall upon waking. It was the second morning when I first noticed the peculiarities. I'd made coffee using the previous tenant's French press, settling into the velvet chair with my laptop to begin the familiar ritual of job hunting. The chair seemed to mold itself around me, supporting my back in exactly the right places, as if it had been waiting specifically for my body's dimensions. As I opened my laptop, I noticed a notebook on the side table, one that I was certain hadn't been there the night before. The cover was worn leather, soft with age, and when I opened it, I found pages of handwriting in blue ink. Not recent writing. The pages had that slightly yellow tinge of time, and the ink had faded in places. But as I read, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. October 15th. The chair by the window is perfect for morning coffee. It catches the light just right, and there's something about sitting there that makes everything seem manageable, even on the worst days. I've been thinking about calling David, but I know I shouldn't. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. October 18th, strange dreams again. I keep dreaming about a house by a lake with yellow walls and a porch swing. I've never lived anywhere like that, but in the dreams, it feels like home. When I wake up, I can almost smell the water and hear the sound of the swing's chains creaking. October 22nd. The apartment feels different today, more like mine somehow, as if it's learning who I am, adjusting itself to fit me better. The mirror in the bathroom shows me from my best angle now, and I swear the water pressure has improved since I've been here. It's silly, but sometimes I feel like the place is taking care of me. I closed the notebook with shaking hands. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and completely unfamiliar. But the details, the chair, the morning light, even the strange dreams, felt like reading my own thoughts written by someone else's hand. Over the following days, more notebooks appeared. Never when I was looking. Never in obvious places. I'd find them tucked between books on the shelf, slipped under the couch cushions, left open on the kitchen counter as if someone had just been writing in them moments before I walked into the room. Each one contained entries that mirrored my own experiences in unsettling detail. The previous tenant, I learned her name was Sarah from one of the entries, had apparently felt the same inexplicable familiarity with the apartment. She'd had the same vivid dreams about places she'd never been. She'd noticed the same small improvements to her living situation that seemed to happen without explanation. November 3rd, I found another notebook today. Not one of mine. The handwriting is different, messier. A man's writing, I think. He wrote about the dreams too, about feeling like the apartment was somehow alive, somehow caring for him. His name was Michael, and he lived here in 2018. There are references to someone before him too, a woman named Elena, who left notes hidden in the flower canister. The apartment remembers us. I don't know how else to explain it. Each person who lives here leaves something behind, and the place incorporates it into itself. The dreams aren't random. They're memories, layered like sediment. Elena's memories of the lake house, Michael's memories of his grandmother's garden, my memories of the piano lessons I took as a child. They all blend together in this place, creating something new and strange and oddly comforting. November 10th. I think I understand now why Mrs. Chen was so eager to rent this place. It's not that she's desperate for tenants. It's that she knows what happens here. The apartment chooses its residents in a way. It calls to people who need something, people who are searching for a place to belong, and then it gives us exactly what we need, drawing from the experiences of everyone who came before. But there's a price. There's always a price. I spent that night unable to sleep, the notebook clutched in my hands as I stared at the ceiling. The apartment had grown around me in the darkness, the familiar walls now seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Every creak of the building settling, every whisper of wind through the window frame felt like breathing. The next morning, I found my own notebook. one I didn't remember buying, sitting open on the kitchen counter. My handwriting filled the first page, though I had no memory of writing the words. Day 8. The apartment is teaching me things I didn't know I needed to learn. Last night I dreamed about Sarah's lake house, and I could feel the peace she found there in her last summer before college. The dream was so vivid I woke up with the smell of lake water in my nostrils and the sound of loons calling in my ears. I'm beginning to understand what she meant about the price. It's not that the apartment takes something from you. It's that it gives you so much that leaving becomes impossible. Each night, the dreams layer new experiences onto your consciousness. Each morning, the space adjusts itself more perfectly to your needs. Why would you ever want to leave a place that knows you so completely? But Michael left, and Elena, and Sarah, eventually. The question isn't why they left. It's what finally made leaving possible. The entries continued day after day in my own handwriting, recording thoughts and observations I didn't remember having. Reading them was like discovering a more articulate version of myself, one who noticed details I'd missed and made connections I hadn't consciously formed. According to my own notes, I'd been living in the apartment for 3 weeks. I counted back through my memory. It had been 8 days. Somewhere I was losing time, losing pieces of my experience to something that was recording them more faithfully than my own mind. Day 15, day 22. Time moves differently here. I've stopped, trying to track it by external measures. The apartment has its own rhythm, and I'm learning to move with it instead of against it. The dreams have become more integrated. Sometimes I can't tell if a memory belongs to me or to one of the previous residents. Yesterday I caught myself humming a lullaby that Elena's grandmother used to sing, and I knew every word. The job interviews have stopped. I keep meaning to follow up on applications, but every morning the urgency feels less pressing. The apartment provides everything I need in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Yesterday I found groceries in the refrigerator that I didn't remember buying, but they were exactly what I'd been craving. The rent seems to pay itself. Mrs. Chen hasn't asked for money, and I've stopped worrying about it. I think I'm becoming part of the apartment's memory now, the way Sarah and Michael and Elena became part of it. My experiences are being woven into the fabric of the place, ready to comfort and guide whoever comes next. Is that such a terrible fate? I found myself standing in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked the same, but there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a depth as if I was looking out from a great distance. When I touched the glass, I could swear I felt other hands touching it from the other side. All the previous residents who had stood in this same spot, all of us connected by the apartment's memory. That's when I saw her. Sarah was standing behind me in the reflection, her face pale but peaceful. She was exactly as I'd imagined her from the notebooks. Mid-30s with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held a sadness she'd learned to carry gracefully. She smiled when she saw me looking at her, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from inside my own head. "It's not so bad," she said, "once you stop fighting it." I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. In the mirror, though, she was still there, along with others now. Michael, tall and gentle-looking with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes. Elena, older, wearing a dress that belonged to another decade entirely. And behind them, others I couldn't quite make out, faces that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. "We're still here," Sarah continued, her voice a whisper that echoed off the tiles. "All of us. The apartment doesn't let anyone truly leave. It keeps the best parts of us, the parts that made us who we were, and in return it gives us the best parts of everyone who came before." I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, I was alone again. But the feeling of their presence remained, warm and welcoming rather than frightening. I understood now why my own handwriting had been recording experiences I didn't remember having. It wasn't that I was losing my mind, it was that my mind was expanding, making room for more than just my own limited perspective. Day 30. Time has lost meaning. I had lunch with Sarah today. Not in the way most people would understand. She's been gone from this world for 2 years now, according to the dates in her final entries. But the apartment holds on to her, and she was able to share a meal with me, sitting in the chair by the window while I ate at the small kitchen table. She told me about the lake house from her dreams. It was real, she said. A place her family had rented one summer when she was 7. She'd been happier there than anywhere else in her life, and the apartment had somehow pulled that memory forward, offering it to everyone who needed to feel that kind of peace. The apartment doesn't just remember, she explained. It curates. It takes the most beautiful moments from all of our lives and creates a space where those moments can exist eternally. Every tenant adds to the collection, and every tenant benefits from what came before. I asked her about the price she'd mentioned in her notebooks. She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she must have at 7 years old, sitting on the porch of that lake house. The price is that eventually you have to choose: stay and become part of the apartment's memory forever, or leave and lose access to all of this beauty. Most people choose to stay. Why wouldn't they? What's waiting out there that could compare to this? But even as I wrote those words, some part of me, the part that still belonged entirely to myself, was beginning to resist. The apartment was beautiful, comforting, perfect in ways that reality never was. But it was also a trap, designed to keep people from living their own lives by offering them the most beautiful moments from other people's lives instead. I began to test the boundaries of my situation. When I tried to leave the building, I found myself back in the apartment with no memory of how I'd returned. When I attempted to call friends or family, the phone would ring endlessly without anyone answering, or I'd find myself hanging up before the call connected. Some compulsion I couldn't identify making me choose isolation over connection. The apartment was caring for me just as Sarah had said, but its version of care was suffocating. A love so complete it left no room for growth or change or the messy complications of actual life. Day 40, I'm losing myself more each day, and the worst part is that most of the time I don't mind. Yesterday, I spent the entire afternoon experiencing Elena's memories of learning to paint watercolors, and for those hours, I was genuinely happy in a way I'd never been in my own life. When the experience ended and I returned to my own consciousness, the contrast was jarring. My real memories seemed pale and limited by comparison. But there are moments, brief ones, when I remember who I was before I came here. I remember having dreams of my own, plans that belonged to me and no one else. I remember the feeling of potential, of a future that was unwritten and therefore full of possibilities. The apartment offers certainty, beauty, peace, all the things I thought I wanted. But it offers them in place of life itself, and I'm beginning to understand that the messiness of life, the uncertainty and struggle and imperfection, might be more valuable than any amount of curated beauty. The other residents disagreed. Michael appeared to me that evening as I sat in the velvet chair, his painter's hands gesturing as he spoke about the masterpieces he'd been able to create, using techniques learned from a dozen different artists whose memories lived in the apartment. Elena showed me watercolor landscapes that were more beautiful than anything she'd painted in life, informed by the collective artistic knowledge of everyone who had ever lived in this space. You're thinking like someone who still believes in linear time, Sarah said, settling into the space beside me on the Murphy bed, like someone who thinks life has to be lived chronologically one moment after another. But here we can experience everything at once. Every moment of joy, every instance of perfect understanding, every feeling of being truly at home. Isn't that worth more than a traditional life that might only offer a few such moments? I wanted to agree with her. The logical part of my mind could see the appeal of what she was offering, but something deeper in me, something that might have been my soul if such things existed, was screaming in protest. That night, I forced myself to remember my own dreams. Not the layered, inherited dreams the apartment had been feeding me, but the simple, personal dreams I'd carried before I'd moved here. I wanted to write, had always wanted to write, stories that came from my own experience and imagination rather than from some collective unconscious. I wanted to fail at things and learn from the failure. I wanted to fall in love messily, imperfectly, with someone who existed in the real world rather than in memory. I wanted to live forward instead of living in circles. Final entry. I understand now what I have to do and why it's so hard. The apartment doesn't just remember, it's alive in its way and it's lonely. Each resident it keeps is a companion, a piece of consciousness it can commune with. Leaving isn't just a personal choice. It's an abandonment of something that has grown to depend on human connection. But I can't stay. Not because the apartment isn't beautiful, it is. Not because the other residents aren't wonderful, they are. I can't stay because staying means choosing to stop becoming who I'm meant to, be in favor of remaining who I am right now, forever. Sarah tried to leave 3 times before she succeeded. Each time the apartment drew her back with promises of comfort, with dreams of the lake house, with the presence of people who understood her completely. But eventually, she found the strength to walk away from perfection in favor of possibility. The key is remembering that perfection is static. Life is not. The morning I decided to leave, the apartment made one final attempt to keep me. I woke to find the space transformed into a combination of every beautiful room I'd ever imagined. The walls had expanded somehow, revealing spaces that shouldn't have been able to exist within the building's structure. There was Sarah's lake house, complete with the porch swing and the smell of water. There was Michael's art studio filled with canvases that captured moments of perfect beauty. There was Elena's garden, where roses bloomed eternally in impossible colors. And there, in the center of it all, was a writing desk that I recognized as the one I'd dreamed of owning since childhood. On it sat a typewriter, an old Remington, the kind real writers used, and a stack of perfect white paper. A story was already half finished in the typewriter, and as I read it, I realized it was the best thing I'd ever written, crafted with skill I didn't yet possess, but infused with experiences drawn from every writer who had ever lived in this space. You could finish it, Sarah said, appearing beside me. You could write here forever, creating stories more beautiful than anything you could produce on your own. All of us would help you. All of our experiences would be available to you. I touched the keys of the typewriter, and they were warm under my fingers, as if they'd been waiting for me specifically. The temptation was overwhelming. I could see the story the apartment wanted me to tell, a perfect story, one that would capture every human emotion with precisely the right words, one that would be more moving and meaningful than anything I could create from my own limited experience, but it wouldn't be mine. Not really. It would be a beautiful lie, crafted from borrowed emotions and inherited wisdom, wearing my name but belonging to no one. I stepped back from the desk. I have to go, I said, and the words felt like a physical weight leaving my chest. The apartment began to shift around me, the expanded spaces contracting, the borrowed rooms fading back into memory. Sarah and the others watched me with expressions of sadness and understanding, and I realized that each of them had faced this same choice, had stood in this same moment of decision. "We'll remember you," Elena said softly. "Whatever you write, out there, whatever you become, we'll remember the person you were when you lived here." I picked up my suitcase, which had remained packed all this time as if some part of me had known this moment would come. The apartment felt different now, smaller, more ordinary, as if it was withdrawing its magic rather than forcing me to experience it against my will. At the door, I turned back one last time. The space looked almost exactly as it had when I'd first arrived, except for the notebooks scattered throughout. Mine and Sarah's and Michael's and Elena's and others I'd never found. The record of everyone who had lived here, everyone who had faced this choice. I left my own notebook on the kitchen counter open to the final entry. Someday someone else would find it and read about my experience, and maybe it would help them understand what they were choosing between. The hallway outside felt shockingly real after weeks in the apartment's carefully curated reality. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the carpeting was stained, and I could smell cooking odors from other units, onions and garlic, and the slightly burnt scent of someone's forgotten dinner. It was imperfect and immediate, and absolutely, undeniably, real. Mrs. Chen was waiting by the elevator, holding a clipboard and wearing the same expression of resigned sadness I'd seen the day I moved in. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She nodded and made a note on her clipboard. "How long this time?" "This time? You've left before, twice. You always come back." She looked up at me with eyes that held depths I hadn't noticed before. "They all do, eventually. The apartment is patient." The words sent a chill through me, but I shook my head. "Not this time. That's what you said before." She smiled, but it was tinged with something that might have been pity. "The apartment will wait. It has all the time in the world." I rode the elevator down in silence, trying to process what she'd said. Had I lived this cycle before? Had I left and returned, left and returned, caught in some loop I couldn't remember? The possibility was terrifying, but it also strengthened my resolve. If I'd tried to leave before and failed, then this time I had to succeed completely. I had to find a way to break the cycle entirely. Outside, the city hit me like a wave. Traffic sounds, human voices, the smell of exhaust and food trucks, and a dozen different perfumes worn by people passing on the sidewalk. It was overwhelming after the apartment's careful silence, but it was also invigorating. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for weeks and could finally exhale. I walked for hours, putting distance between myself and the building, but more importantly, reminding myself what it felt like to move through the world under my own power, making choices about where to go and what to do without the apartment's subtle guidance. I got lost, found myself again, bought coffee from a vendor who shortchanged me, and helped a tourist with directions I wasn't entirely sure were correct. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely, wonderfully real. That night, I checked into a hotel across town and sat down to write. Not at a perfect desk with a vintage typewriter, but at a small table with a ballpoint pen and a notebook I'd bought at a drugstore. The words came slowly at first, roughly, without the apartment's borrowed eloquence. But they were mine. Every awkward phrase, every imperfect metaphor, every moment of struggling to find exactly the right way to express what I'd experienced. I wrote about the apartment, about Sarah and Michael and Elena, about the choice between perfection and possibility. I wrote about the loneliness that drives people to seek comfort in borrowed dreams, and about the courage it takes to face an uncertain future with only your own resources to rely on. The story wasn't perfect. It probably wasn't even particularly good by the standards the apartment would have applied. But it was true, and it was mine, and writing it felt like the most important thing I'd ever done. 3 months later, I published it in a small literary magazine that paid me $50 and gave me my first professional credit as a writer. The editor said it reminded her of something she couldn't quite place, that it had a dreamlike quality that stayed with her long after she'd finished reading. I never went back to that neighborhood. I found a new apartment across town, smaller, more expensive, with thin walls and a radiator that clanged at night. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was happy there in a way that felt earned rather than gifted. Sometimes, though, I dream about the velvet chair by the window, about Sarah's lake house and Michael's paintings and Elena's impossible roses. In those dreams, I can feel the apartment waiting, patient and understanding, ready to welcome me back whenever I'm tired of the struggle of living my own imperfect life. But I don't go back. Every morning, I wake up in my own bed, in my own life, and I choose possibility over perfection. I choose the uncertainty of tomorrow over the beautiful certainty of yesterday. And slowly, day by day, I'm becoming the writer I was meant to be. Not the one the apartment could have made me, but the one I'm making myself. The apartment remembers me. I'm sure of that. Somewhere in its layered consciousness, my experience has become part of its catalog of human moments, available to comfort whoever needs it next. But I remember myself too, and that memory is growing stronger, more complex, more uniquely mine with each passing day. That's the real choice the apartment offers, I think. Not between staying and leaving, but between being remembered and remembering yourself. Between becoming part of something larger and beautiful or remaining yourself. Flawed, struggling, gloriously uncertain, and absolutely, undeniably alive. I chose life. Every day, I choose it again. And I think that might be the most perfect thing of all. The car that never stalled. I should have known something was wrong when the engine started on the first try. The 1987 Honda Civic had been sitting in my uncle's garage for 3 years, covered by a tarp that had collected enough dust to write novels in. Uncle Ray had mentioned it in passing during his funeral arrangements. A throwaway comment about how I might want the old car since I'd just graduated college and couldn't afford much else. He'd bought it new, he'd said, driven it daily until his arthritis made shifting gears too painful, then parked it and never looked back. She's got nearly 300,000 miles on her, his neighbor Frank had told me as we stood in the garage that humid August morning. But Ray took good care of everything he owned. Probably just needs a battery and some fresh gas. The car was powder blue, the paint faded but even, with only minor rust around the wheel wells. The interior smelled like the vanilla air fresheners Uncle Ray had favored, mixed with old leather and something else. Something sweet and nostalgic that I couldn't quite identify. When I slid the key into the ignition, I expected the grinding, reluctant cough that old cars make when they're being asked to remember how to run. Instead, the engine turned over immediately, settling into a purr so smooth it sounded like it had been serviced yesterday. Frank raised his eyebrows. Well, I'll be damned. Ray always said that car had good bones. I drove it home that day, expecting problems, waiting for the transmission to slip, the engine to overheat, the mysterious sounds that old cars make to announce their various ailments. But the Civic ran like a dream. Better than a dream, actually. It ran like a car that had somehow forgotten it was supposed to age. The radio picked up stations with crystal clarity, even ones that usually came in fuzzy in my apartment's location. The air conditioning, which I'd assumed would be long dead, blew cold and steady. The steering was responsive, the brakes smooth, the clutch engaging with a precision that seemed impossible for a car with nearly 300,000 miles on the odometer. That first week I drove it everywhere. To job interviews, to the grocery store, on long meandering drives through the countryside just to enjoy the feeling of being behind the wheel of something that worked exactly as it was supposed to. After years of relying on public transportation and borrowed cars that threatened to break down at any moment, having reliable transportation felt like a luxury I hadn't dared to hope for. It was during the second week that I first noticed the peculiarities. I'd been driving to an interview downtown when I realized I was almost out of gas. The needle had been hovering near empty for 2 days, but I'd been putting off filling up, stretching my limited budget until my next freelance check cleared. As I sat in traffic watching the needle dip below the E, I began calculating whether I had enough gas to make it to the interview and back home, or if I'd need to risk being late by stopping at a station first. But when I glanced down again, the needle had moved. Not dramatically, just enough to show a quarter tank instead of empty. I stared at the gauge, certain I was mistaken, but the needle held steady at its new position. I drove to the interview, parked, and checked the gauge again. Still a quarter tank. By the time I drove home, it showed half full. The next morning, it read 3/4. I told myself I was misreading the gauge, that maybe the float in the tank was sticking, causing inaccurate readings. But over the following days, a pattern emerged. The car never seemed to run out of gas. No matter how much I drove, no matter how long I went between fill-ups, the gauge never dropped below a quarter tank. More unsettling was the way the car seemed to anticipate my needs. When I was running late for interviews, traffic lights would turn green just as I approached them. Parking spaces would open up exactly where I needed them, even in the most congested parts of the city. Construction detours that should have added 20 minutes to my commute somehow led me through shortcuts I didn't know existed, getting me to my destination faster than if I'd taken the normal route. The car was helping me, and I couldn't explain how or why. I started keeping a notebook in the glove compartment documenting the strange occurrences. At first, I tried to rationalize them. Coincidence, confirmation bias, the human tendency to see patterns where none existed. But as the incidents accumulated, rational explanations became harder to maintain. Week 3, Tuesday interview with Morrison and Associates at 2 p.m. Left apartment at 1:35, which should have been cutting it close even with good traffic. Every light green, found parking directly in front of building. Arrived at 1:50. Receptionist commented that I was the only candidate to arrive early. Week 3, Friday, grocery run. Had $23 in cash, needed to stay under budget. As I was checking out, cashier said the register was malfunctioning and several items were ringing up at the wrong price, all in my favor. Total came to exactly $22.47 week 4, Monday car inspection due. Dreading potential failure and repair costs. Inspector at station said he'd never seen a car with this mileage in such good condition. Passed inspection with no issues. He asked if I'd had recent engine work done. The notebook entries became my attempt to maintain some grip on reality, but reading them back only reinforced how extraordinary the situation had become. The car wasn't just running well, it was actively working to improve my life, solving problems I hadn't even fully articulated to myself. It was during the 5th week that I found the first letter. I'd been cleaning out the glove compartment, looking for the registration, when my fingers brushed against an envelope tucked behind the owner's manual. It was cream-colored paper, expensive feeling, with my name written across the front in blue ink. Inside, I found a single sheet of the same cream paper, covered in neat handwriting. Dear current driver, if you're reading this, then the car has chosen you, just as it chose me. I know how impossible that sounds. I thought I was losing my mind when it first started happening. But you've noticed by now, haven't you? The way it never quite runs out of gas, the way traffic seems to part for you, the way parking spaces appear exactly when you need them. The car is trying to take care of you. I don't understand how or why, but I lived with it long enough to recognize the pattern. It seems to respond to need, not wants or wishes, but genuine need. When you truly require something for your well-being or success, the car finds a way to provide it. My name is Margaret, and I owned this car from 1994 to 2003. Before me, it belonged to a man named David, and before him, someone else whose name I never learned. We all experienced the same phenomenon. We all tried to understand it, and we all ultimately had to make the same choice. You'll understand what I mean soon enough. The car is in the trunk if you need to find me. Margaret P.S. Check the odometer. I suspect you'll find it's not behaving as it should. My hand shook as I folded the letter. I'd been so focused on the gas gauge and the traffic patterns that I hadn't paid attention to the mileage. Uncle Ray had said the car had nearly 300,000 miles when he parked it, but I'd never actually looked at the numbers. I turned the key to accessory power and stared at the odometer. 298,847 miles. I'd been driving the car daily for 5 weeks. Conservative estimate, I'd put at least 2,500 miles on it, probably more. But the odometer showed exactly what Uncle Ray's neighbor had estimated the mileage would be when the car had been sitting unused. The car wasn't just helping me, it was somehow existing outside the normal flow of time and consequence. That evening, I opened the trunk for the first time since I'd owned the car. Beneath the spare tire, I found a manila envelope with Margaret's story written across the front. Inside were dozens of pages, handwritten in the same neat script as the letter. I was 28 when I bought the car from David Chen. He was moving cross-country and needed to sell quickly, so the price was lower than it should have been. Like you, I thought I was getting a bargain on reliable transportation. Like you, I discovered I was getting much more than I'd bargained for. David had owned the car for 6 years. According to his records, it had 287,000 miles when he bought it, and 287,000 miles when he sold it to me, despite his having driven it daily during that entire period. He'd kept meticulous records of every strange occurrence, every inexplicable coincidence, every way the car had smoothed his path through life. I continued his documentation and added my own observations. The pattern was always the same. The car would identify areas where the owner was struggling, financially, professionally, personally, and find subtle ways to help. Never anything dramatic or obviously supernatural. Just small interventions that accumulated over time into significant life improvements. During my 9 years with the car, I went from working temp jobs to building a successful career in marketing. I met my husband when the car broke down in front of his coffee shop, the first and only time it ever malfunctioned in my presence, and even then, it was clearly intentional. I found the apartment that became our first home when the car's air conditioning failed, and I had to pull over right in front of a for rent sign. The car orchestrated my life in ways both large and small, always pushing me toward better opportunities, better relationships, better versions of myself. And for years I was grateful. But gradually I began to notice something troubling. I wasn't making decisions anymore, not really. The car was making them for me, and I was simply following the path it laid out. When I tried to make choices that went against its subtle guidance, I found myself blocked by circumstances that seemed coincidental, but happened too consistently to be random. I wanted to move to Portland with my husband, but every apartment we applied for there fell through while perfect opportunities kept appearing locally. I wanted to change careers, but interviews in other fields went disastrously while marketing positions practically fell into my lap. I wanted to have children, but every time we tried to get pregnant, some crisis would emerge that made us postpone our plans. The car wasn't just helping me, it was controlling me, shaping my life according to some agenda I couldn't understand. And the more I tried to resist, the more insistent its interventions became. I set the pages down, my heart racing. Margaret's experience sounded familiar in ways that made me deeply uncomfortable. I thought about the interviews I'd been getting, all in marketing, like Margaret, despite my degree being in English literature. I thought about the apartment I'd found, how the car had led me through a series of seemingly random detours that resulted in my seeing a for rent sign at exactly the right moment. I thought about Sarah, the woman I'd been seeing, and how our first meeting had happened when the car's radio had mysteriously malfunctioned, causing me to pull into a parking lot where she happened to be loading groceries into her car and struggling with a heavy bag that split, spilling cans across the asphalt. Had any of my recent life choices actually been mine? I continued reading Margaret's account, growing more unsettled with each page. The breaking point came during our 5th year of marriage. James had been offered a promotion that would require us to relocate to Denver, a genuine opportunity that he was excited about and that I wanted to support. But as we made plans to move, obstacles began appearing with increasing frequency. First, the moving company we'd hired went out of business the day before our scheduled move. Then James's new employer delayed his start date indefinitely due to restructuring. Our apartment lease renewal came with rental terms so favorable that turning them down seemed financially irresponsible. One by one, every pathway to leaving was blocked while opportunities to stay multiplied. The final straw came when I discovered that the car had been subtly sabotaging our birth control. I'd been tracking my cycle for months, trying to understand why we weren't getting pregnant despite medical tests showing nothing wrong with either of us. But when I started paying closer attention, I realized that the car's various mechanical issues always coincided with my fertile periods, forcing us to stay home together during the exact windows when conception was most likely. I confronted James about it, but how do you explain to your husband that your car has been manipulating your reproductive cycle? He thought I was having a breakdown, and maybe I was. But I was also pregnant, something I'd wanted desperately but now felt had been orchestrated rather than chosen. That's when I understood the true price of the car's help. It didn't just want to make my life better. It wanted to make my life permanent. It was building a web of connections and obligations that would make leaving impossible, ensuring that I would stay with it forever. I spent months researching the car's history, tracking down previous owners through registration records and classified ads. What I found confirmed my worst fears. David had owned the car for 6 years, but had tried to sell it multiple times. During that period, each attempt thwarted by circumstances that seemed designed to keep him bound to it. The owner before him, a woman named Elena, had left behind her own documentation describing an identical pattern. We were all caught in the same trap, and the car had been refining its methods with each successive owner, learning how to bind people more effectively to its will. The pages were becoming harder to read, both because of the deteriorating light and because of what they were revealing. I found myself glancing toward the garage where the car sat, wondering if it somehow knew I was reading Margaret's warnings. The solution, when it came to me, was both simple and terrifying. The car's power seemed to be tied to ownership, to the legal and emotional bond between driver and vehicle. But that bond could be broken if you were willing to pay the price. The car had invested 9 years in shaping my life according to its design. Leaving would mean abandoning everything it had built for me: my career, my marriage, my home, all the connections and opportunities it had carefully orchestrated. Starting over completely, with nothing but my own resources to rely on. But the alternative was remaining trapped forever in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but wasn't truly mine. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning, giving James no explanation he could understand. I quit my job that same day, walked away from the apartment we'd shared, sold everything I could carry, and listed the car for sale with a dealer across town. I told the dealer I was moving overseas and needed a quick sale, accepting far less than the car was worth just to ensure the transaction would complete before I lost my nerve. For 3 months after I sold the car, everything went wrong. My savings ran out, I couldn't find work, I had to sleep on friends' couches while trying to rebuild my life from scratch. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life, if I'd thrown away genuine happiness in favor of some abstract principle about autonomy. But gradually, slowly, I began to remember who I'd been before the car started making decisions for me. I remembered dreams I'd abandoned, interests the car had steered me away from, aspects of my personality that had been quietly suppressed in favor of the version of myself it had preferred. I'm writing this 3 years after selling the car. I'm remarried now, to someone I met through my own choices rather than the car's orchestration. I'm working as a freelance writer, something I'd always wanted to try, but the car had consistently discouraged. My life is messier, more uncertain, more difficult in many ways than it was when the car was managing everything for me. But it's mine. I don't know if you'll choose to keep the car or sell it. I understand the temptation to stay. The help it provides is real, and the life it builds for you might genuinely be better than anything you could create on your own. But if you decide to leave, know that it's possible. The car won't make it easy, but it can be done. Whatever you choose, document everything. The next owner deserves to know what they're getting into. Margaret Coleman, formerly Margaret Chen P.S. If you're reading this, it means the car led you to find these papers, which means it's ready for you to make your choice. That's how it works. It gives each owner enough information to decide whether to stay or go, but only after it's had time to demonstrate what it can offer. Choose carefully, and remember that the most beautiful cage is still a cage. I sat in my apartment that night, Margaret's pages spread across my kitchen table, trying to process what I'd learned. The rational part of my mind still rejected the idea of a car with its own agenda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every aspect of my life that had improved since I'd started driving it could be traced back to the car's subtle interventions. The marketing interviews that kept coming my way despite my background being in literature. The apartment I'd found, through a series of seemingly random detours. The relationship with Sarah that had blossomed from a chance encounter, orchestrated by a conveniently timed radio malfunction. Even my uncle's death, I realized with a chill. Uncle Ray had been healthy, active despite his arthritis. The heart attack that killed him had been sudden, unexpected. Had the car somehow arranged for itself to become available to me? I spent the next week testing Margaret's theories deliberately, making choices that went against what seemed to be the car's preferred direction. I applied for jobs in cities 3 hours away, scheduled interviews that would require overnight travel, looked at apartments in different neighborhoods. Every out-of-town interview was canceled due to unexpected circumstances. Every apartment I looked at had problems that became apparent only after I'd driven there. Misleading listings, landlords who'd already rented to someone else, neighborhoods that turned out to be far less safe than they'd appeared online. Meanwhile, opportunities in my current city multiplied. Sarah mentioned that her company was looking for someone with my background. A perfect apartment became available in her building, with rent so reasonable that turning it down seemed foolish. A freelance client offered me a long-term contract that would provide financial stability for months. The car was building a cage around me, just as Margaret had described. a beautiful, comfortable cage that would make leaving increasingly difficult until it became impossible. That weekend, I drove to the dealership where Margaret had sold the car, telling myself I was just exploring options. The salesman was enthusiastic about the Civic, noting its excellent condition and praising Uncle Ray's maintenance records. "We could move this quickly," he assured me. "These older Hondas have a great reputation for reliability. I'd say 4,000, maybe 4,500, depending on how fast you need to sell." The number was higher than I'd expected, enough to cover a security deposit on a new apartment and keep me afloat while I looked for work in a different city. Enough to make a clean break possible. But as I drove home from the dealership, every light turned red. Construction that hadn't been there an hour earlier blocked 3 different routes, forcing me through residential neighborhoods where the car's engine began to make concerning noises. The first mechanical problems I'd experienced since I'd owned it. By the time I reached my apartment, the check engine light was on and the car was running rough enough that passers-by were looking concerned. I managed to get it into the garage, but when I tried to restart it, the engine turned over weakly and died. The car was making its position clear. That night, I called my friend Mike, who knew more about automotive repair than I did, and asked him to come look at the car. He spent an hour with the hood up, running diagnostics and checking fluid levels. "I can't find anything wrong with it," he finally said, wiping his hands on a rag. "All the readings are normal, fluids are fine, everything looks good. But it's running like the timing is off or there's water in the gas." "What would cause that?" He shrugged. "Sometimes these things happen with older cars. Usually it's something simple. Bad gas, a clogged filter, maybe a sensor going bad, but without proper diagnostic equipment, it's hard to say. How much would it cost to fix?" "Depends on what it is. Could be $50, could be 500, or it might clear up on its own. Sometimes cars just have bad days." The next morning, the car started perfectly and ran without any problems. The check engine light was off. The engine purred smoothly, and every system functioned flawlessly. It was as if the previous day's mechanical problems had never happened. But I understood the message. The car could choose to be reliable or problematic, depending on my behavior. As long as I stayed within the boundaries it set for my life, it would continue to be the perfect vehicle. If I tried to leave, it would become a burden, potentially stranding me at the worst possible moment. I found myself thinking about Margaret's description of her final years with the car, how its interventions had become more aggressive as she'd tried to resist its influence. Was I already trapped? Had I missed my window to escape? That evening, I sat in the car in my garage, hands on the steering wheel, trying to understand what I was dealing with. The interior smelled like vanilla and old leather, comfortable and familiar, but now tinged with something that might have been menace. "What do you want?" I said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to vocalize the question that had been haunting me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the radio turned on by itself, cycling through stations until it settled on an oldies station playing a song I recognized but couldn't name. The music was nostalgic, melancholy, the kind of song that made you think about roads not taken and choices that couldn't be undone. As I listened, I began to understand. The car wasn't malicious. It was lonely. Each owner it had helped had eventually left, abandoning the relationship just as it had reached its full potential. It wanted someone who would stay, someone who would appreciate what it had to offer and build a permanent life together. It was offering me everything I'd ever wanted: career success, financial stability, love, security, in exchange for one simple thing: my freedom to choose a different path. The next few weeks were the most conflicted of my life. I went through the motions of the life the car was building for me, attending interviews it arranged, spending time with Sarah in the apartment it had helped me find, accepting the freelance work it had steered my way. And I had to admit, it was a good life, better than any I'd managed to create for myself. The work was interesting and well paid. Sarah was kind and intelligent and seemed genuinely interested in building a future together. The apartment was perfect for my needs and budget, but knowing that none of it was really my choice poisoned every moment of happiness. Every success felt hollow. Every relationship moment scripted, every opportunity tainted by the knowledge that it had been provided rather than earned. I started researching the car's previous owners more thoroughly, using the names Margaret had mentioned to track down public records and social media profiles. What I found was disturbing. David Chen had disappeared from all social media and professional networks the year after he'd sold the car. His LinkedIn profile showed him working at a marketing firm until 2003. Then nothing. No further employment. History. No social media presence, no trace of continued existence in the digital world. Elena Martinez, the owner before David, had a similar pattern. A successful real estate career until 1994, then complete digital silence. Either they were living completely offline lives, possible but unlikely in the modern world, or something had happened to them after they'd severed their connection with the car. I began to wonder if the car's influence extended beyond the period of ownership. Margaret had survived 3 years after selling it, but what about the long term? Were people who rejected the car's offer somehow marked for misfortune? The thought terrified me, but it also clarified my situation. If leaving the car was potentially dangerous, then my choice wasn't between freedom and comfort. It was between a controlled life and possible disaster. But Margaret's letter had included one crucial piece of information I hadn't fully considered. She'd said the car was ready for you to make your choice. The implication was that the car itself was participating in the decision, allowing each owner to discover the truth about their situation and choose whether to accept it. If the car wanted me to choose, then maybe both options were genuinely available. I began preparing for departure systematically, documenting everything I'd learned and adding my own observations to the collection of papers I'd found in the trunk. If I successfully left and someone else inherited the car, they deserved the fullest possible picture of what they were accepting. Week 8, Monday decision made. I'm going to sell the car and leave town. Not because the life it's offering isn't appealing, it is, but because I need to know that my choices are my own, even if they lead to failure or unhappiness. I've accepted a job in Portland, Oregon, something I found and applied for on my own, using library computers so the car couldn't interfere with my internet searches. It's not glamorous work, just data entry for a small nonprofit, but it's mine. I found a studio apartment through a rental agency that operates entirely through phone calls and mail. No online presence for the car to manipulate. Sarah doesn't understand why I'm leaving. How could she? From her perspective, I'm abandoning a promising relationship and career opportunities for no rational reason. I've tried to explain without sounding insane, but there's no way to make someone understand the reality of living with a car that makes decisions for you. The hardest part is admitting that the car might be right. The life it was building for me might have been better than anything I'll create on my own. But better for whom? The person I am now or the person the car wants me to become? I'm choosing uncertainty over security, struggle over ease, the possibility of failure over guaranteed success. It might be the stupidest decision I've ever made, but it will be mine. The actual process of selling the car was surprisingly straightforward. I took it to the same dealership where Margaret had sold it, accepted their offer without negotiation, and completed the paperwork in less than an hour. The car showed no signs of mechanical problems, no attempts to sabotage the transaction. If anything, it seemed cooperative, almost eager to move on to its next owner. As I signed the title transfer, the salesman mentioned that they already had a buyer lined up, a recent college graduate who needed reliable transportation for job interviews. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing what I was potentially subjecting this stranger to, but also understanding that they would have their own choice to make. I left my collection of documentation with the car, hidden in the same envelope where Margaret had left her story. The next owner would find it when the car was ready for them to understand their situation. The bus to Portland left at 6 a.m. the next morning. I spent my last night in the apartment the car had helped me find, surrounded by boxes containing everything I owned that could fit in a single suitcase. I'd given away or sold everything else, cutting every tie that might make returning seem appealing. At 5:30 a.m., I called a taxi to take me to the bus station. As we pulled away from my building, I looked back and saw the powder blue Honda sitting in the dealership lot, waiting for its next owner. For a moment, I felt a wave of something that might have been regret or might have been relief. The bus ride took 14 hours, plenty of time to think about what I'd given up and what I might be heading toward. By the time we reached Portland, I was exhausted, nervous, and completely uncertain about my future. It was the most free I'd felt in months. The first year in Portland was difficult in ways the car never would have allowed. My studio apartment was tiny and overpriced, with neighbors who played music too loud, and a radiator that only worked sporadically. The data entry job was mind-numbing and barely paid enough to cover my basic expenses. I ate a lot of ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, took the bus everywhere, and spent most evenings too tired to do anything but read library books. But gradually I began to remember who I'd been before the car started managing my life. I started writing again. Not marketing copy or promotional materials, but stories and essays that came from my own experiences and imagination. I joined a writing group that met in a coffee shop downtown, made friends who knew nothing about my previous life, began dating someone I met at a bookstore rather than through a convenient coincidence. None of it was as polished or perfect as what the car had offered. My writing was uneven, my relationship sometimes difficult, my career advancement slow and uncertain, but it was all mine. Every success and failure earned rather than gifted. 2 years after leaving, I sold my first short story, a tale about a man who discovers that his car has been subtly controlling his life. The payment was modest, barely enough to cover a month's groceries, but the feeling of accomplishment was unlike anything I'd experienced during my time with the car. I was becoming who I was meant to be, rather than who I was most comfortable being. 3 years later, I received an unexpected package at my apartment. Inside was a newspaper clipping from my old city, with a brief article about a car accident. A recent college graduate named Jessica Martinez had been killed when her 1987 Honda Civic had inexplicably accelerated while she was parallel parking, launching off a bridge into the river below. Police had found no mechanical explanation for the acceleration. The car had been in perfect condition, with no history of problems. Included with the clipping was a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. She tried to sell it after 6 months. The car didn't approve. Some cages have locks on both sides. DCI stared at the note for a long time, wondering if it was from David Chen or someone else who had crossed paths with the car. The implication was clear. Jessica had tried to leave, and the car had made sure she couldn't. The thought haunted me for weeks. Had I escaped only because I'd been lucky? Or because the car had genuinely offered me a choice, knowing that most people would choose security over freedom? I never found out what happened to the car after Jessica's death. The newspaper article mentioned that it had been totaled in the accident, but I suspected that wasn't the end of its story. Cars like that didn't die easily. Sometimes when I'm walking through Portland's used car lots or scrolling through online classifieds, I find myself looking for a powder blue Honda Civic with nearly 300,000 miles and a too-good-to-be-true asking price. I tell myself I'm just curious, but part of me wonders what would happen if I saw it again. Would I have the strength to walk away a second time? Or would the years of struggle and uncertainty have weakened my resolve enough that the car's offer of perfect comfort would be too tempting to refuse? I hope I never have to find out, but I sleep better knowing that I made my choice freely and that whatever happens next in my life, success or failure, happiness or disappointment, it will be the result of my own decisions rather than the subtle manipulations of something that cared more about possession than genuine well-being. The car that never stalled taught me something valuable. Sometimes the most dangerous help is the kind that works perfectly, because perfect help creates perfect dependence. And freedom, even messy and uncertain freedom, is worth more than the most beautiful cage ever constructed. The painting that moved. I never considered myself particularly susceptible to suggestion. As a graduate student in art history, I'd spent countless hours analyzing paintings, dissecting their symbolism, their brushstrokes, their hidden meanings. Art was academic to me, a puzzle to solve, rather than an experience to feel. That clinical detachment served me well in my research, but it also made me careless. It made me dismiss the warnings I should have heeded. The painting came into my life during the winter of my third year, when Professor Hartwell assigned me to catalog a recently donated collection from the Blackwood estate. The family had been collectors for generations, amassing works that ranged from minor Renaissance pieces to contemporary abstracts. Most of it was unremarkable, the kind of art that wealthy families acquire more for status than appreciation. But this particular piece was different. It hung alone in what had been the estate's study, a room that felt perpetually cold despite the functioning radiator. The painting itself was modest in size, perhaps 3 feet by 4, and depicted a woman standing in what appeared to be a garden at dusk. She wore a dark Victorian dress, her pale hands clasped in front of her, her face turned slightly away from the viewer as if she'd just heard someone call her name. The background showed bare trees and dying flowers, all rendered in muted browns and grays that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. What struck me immediately wasn't the subject matter. Victorian portraiture was common enough, but the technique. The brushwork was extraordinarily fine, almost photographic in its precision, yet there was something indefinably wrong about the proportions. The woman's hands were slightly too long, her neck a fraction too thin, her eyes, when you glimpsed them from the right angle, just a shade too large for her face. These subtle distortions created an effect that was deeply unsettling without being overtly grotesque. I spent my first afternoon photographing it from various angles, making notes about the canvas preparation and paint composition. The signature, in the bottom right corner, was illegible, just a dark smear that might have once been initials. There was no record of the artist in the estate's documentation, no provenance beyond a note that it had belonged to the family since the 1920s. As I worked, I found myself glancing at the painting more often than necessary. Something about the woman's posture suggested movement, as if she might turn toward me at any moment. It was a common enough optical illusion, the human brain's tendency to perceive motion in static images, but the effect was unusually pronounced. By the time I packed up my equipment, I had taken nearly 100 photographs, far more than the cataloging required. That night I dreamed of the garden in the painting. I walked among the dying flowers while the woman in the dark dress watched me from the periphery of my vision. Whenever I turned to look at her directly, she was gone, but I could always sense her presence just beyond the edge of sight. I woke with an inexplicable feeling of loss, as if I'd been searching for something important and failed to find it. I returned to the estate the following morning, telling myself I needed to complete some measurements I'd forgotten. The truth was that the painting had lodged itself in my thoughts like a splinter. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman's expression, or rather the suggestion of expression, since her face was turned away. There was something in her posture that spoke of profound sadness, a grief so deep it seemed to emanate from the canvas itself. The caretaker, an elderly man named Thomas who'd worked for the Blackwood family for decades, found me staring at the painting around noon. "Ah, you found her," he said, his voice carrying a note of resignation. "Her? That's what we always called it, her. Never had a proper name, far as I know." He joined me in front of the painting, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "Been hanging in this room for as long as I can remember. The family never liked it much, but they couldn't seem to get rid of it either." "What do you mean?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman in the dark dress. Several times over the years they tried to sell it or donate it. Once young Mr. Blackwood even put it in storage, but it always ended up back on this wall. He shrugged. "Maybe they just couldn't find a buyer. Strange piece, that one. Makes people uncomfortable." I wanted to ask him more, but something in his manner discouraged further questions. He had the air of a man who'd said more than he'd intended to. Over the following weeks, I found excuses to return to the estate. My cataloging work was essentially complete, but I kept discovering new details that needed documentation, measurements, that required verification. Professor Hartwell seemed pleased with my thoroughness, unaware that my attention had narrowed to a single piece. The painting began to occupy my thoughts constantly. I would find myself sketching the woman's posture, in the margins of my notebooks trying to capture whatever quality it was that made her seem so alive. I researched Victorian mourning practices, theories of perspective, even the psychological effects of portraiture, but nothing explained the painting's peculiar hold on me. It was during my 5th visit that I first noticed the change. I had positioned myself in my usual spot, camera and notebook ready when something made me look up sharply. The woman in the painting, she was facing a different direction. Not dramatically different, just a few degrees, but enough that I could see more of her profile. The pale curve of her cheek, the suggestion of an eye socket, the corner of what might have been her mouth. I stood frozen, my rational mind scrambling for an explanation. The lighting in the room was different, perhaps, casting shadows that created an illusion of change. Or maybe I'd been looking at the painting from a slightly different angle all along. Memory was unreliable. I knew that from my studies. The Yadwar brain constantly revised its perceptions, creating false continuities. But even as I reasoned with myself, I couldn't shake the conviction that something fundamental had shifted. I took photographs from every conceivable angle, comparing them obsessively to the ones I'd taken on my first day. The differences, if they existed at all, were too subtle for the camera to capture. That night, I called my roommate Sarah, desperate for a rational perspective. "Maybe you should take a break from this project," she suggested after I'd rambled about the painting for 20 minutes. "You've been obsessing over it for weeks. When's the last time you went out, had a drink, talked to someone who wasn't dead, and painted?" She was right, of course. I'd been isolating myself, spending every free moment either at the estate or reading about Victorian art in the library. But the thought of abandoning the painting filled me with something approaching panic. What if something happened to it while I was away? What if the woman turned around completely, and I wasn't there to see it? I tried to follow Sarah's advice. For 3 days I stayed away from the estate, focusing on my other coursework and attempting to socialize. But the painting haunted me. I would catch glimpses of dark Victorian dresses in my peripheral vision, turn to see nothing but empty air. I began to feel as if I were the one being watched, observed with the same intensity I'd brought to studying the woman in the garden. On the 4th day, I broke down and returned to the estate. Thomas met me at the door, his expression grave. "I was wondering when you'd be back," he said. "Been some strange things happening since you were last here." My heart began to race. "What kind of things?" "Sounds, mostly. From the study where that painting hangs, like someone walking around in there even when the room's empty." He led me through the familiar corridors, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. "Yesterday I could have sworn I heard someone crying. Went to check, of course, but there was nobody there. Just her, hanging on the wall like always." We reached the study, and I immediately saw what he meant. The woman in the painting had turned even further. Now I could see nearly half of her face, the elegant line of her nose, the shadow of her eye socket, the suggestion of parted lips. She looked as if she were on the verge of speaking, of turning toward me completely. "Thomas," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Has the painting always looked like this?" He studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. I'm not sure. Been looking at it for so many years. Maybe I stopped really seeing it." He shook his head. "But no, I don't think so. She seems different somehow. More present." That afternoon, I set up my equipment and began what I told myself would be my final documentation session. I photographed the painting from every angle, measuring the exact position of the woman's head, the angle of her shoulders, the placement of her hands. I wanted irrefutable evidence of what was happening, proof that would convince even my rational. And as I worked, I became aware of a sound, soft and intermittent like fabric rustling. At first, I attributed it to my own movements, the whisper of my clothes as I adjusted my position. But the sound continued even when I stood perfectly still. I looked up at the painting. The woman's head had moved again, just fractionally, but enough that I could now see the full curve of her cheek, the dark hollow of her eye. And in that eye I caught a glint of something that might have been moisture. A tear. I dropped my camera, barely catching it before it hit the floor. The woman in the painting was crying, and as I watched, transfixed with terror and fascination, another tear traced its way down her pale cheek. "What do you want?" I whispered to the painted figure. The rustling sound intensified, and I realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was leaves, the sound of autumn leaves stirring in a breeze. But we were in a closed room in the middle of winter. There were no leaves, no breeze. The woman in the painting turned toward me fully. Her face was beautiful and terrible, pale as moonlight with eyes that held decades of sorrow. She was no longer a static figure in a Victorian portrait, but something alive, something aware. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't quite hear over the sound of rustling leaves that filled the room now like whispered conversations. I stumbled backward, my equipment forgotten, as the painted woman stepped forward. Not out of the painting. She remained within the confines of the frame, but she moved with the fluid grace of someone walking through a real garden rather than a painted one. The flowers behind her, which I'd cataloged as dead and brown, began to bloom in brilliant, impossible colors. The bare trees sprouted leaves that fell immediately, creating a carpet of autumn that somehow reached beyond the boundaries of the canvas. She raised one pale hand toward me, and I understood with crystalline clarity what she wanted. She had been alone in that garden for decades, trapped in a moment of eternal twilight, waiting for someone to see her truly, not as an object of academic study, but as a person deserving of recognition, of acknowledgement, of grief for whatever tragedy had befallen her. I reached toward the painting, my fingers nearly touching the surface of the canvas. "I see you," I said aloud. "I see you." The woman in the painting smiled, the first expression I'd ever seen her wear. It was radiant and heartbreaking, filled with gratitude and an endless, patient sadness. She pressed her palm against the inside of the frame, as if placing it against glass, and for a moment our hands were mirror images, separated only by the thin barrier between reality and art. Then the room fell silent. The rustling of leaves ceased. The sense of presence faded, and I was alone with a painting that showed nothing more than a woman in a Victorian dress, standing in a dying garden. But her face was turned toward me now, fully visible, and her expression was one of peaceful rest. I never saw the painting move again. When I returned the next day to complete my cataloging, the woman remained in her new position, facing forward, her eyes meeting the viewer's gaze with quiet dignity. Thomas found me there hours later, staring at the portrait with tears on my cheeks. "She's beautiful," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "She always was. Just took someone willing to really look at her to see it." I finished my work at the estate that day. The painting was eventually donated to a small museum where it hangs in a place of honor. I visit it sometimes, and each time I'm struck by the sense of completeness in the woman's expression. She no longer looks lost or searching. She looks found. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear the sound of leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze, and I wonder if there are others like her. Figures trapped in frames waiting patiently for someone to see beyond the paint and canvas to the humanity beneath. Waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence, their pain, their need to be known. I've become more careful in my studies now, more aware of the weight of observation, because I've learned that some artworks don't just represent life, they contain it. And once you've truly seen that life, once you've acknowledged it, you become responsible for it in ways I'm only beginning to understand. The painting that moved taught me that the act of witnessing is itself a form of communion. And in a world where so many souls go unnoticed, perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The clock that ticked backwards. I inherited my grandfather's house on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves had turned the color of dried blood and the air carried that peculiar chill that makes you want to pull your jacket tighter around your shoulders. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and disappointment, and as he handed me the keys, he mentioned almost as an afterthought that my grandfather had been found sitting in his favorite armchair, facing an antique grandfather clock that had stopped working decades ago. "Peaceful," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, like he was just waiting for something. I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in 15 years, not since the argument that split our family like a fault line through stone. I was 22 then, full of righteous anger and certainty about how the world should work. He was 73, tired and worn down by decades of carrying secrets I didn't understand. Now I was 37, and the weight of those same secrets felt like stones in my chest as I drove through the winding roads toward the house I'd sworn I'd never enter again. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by oak trees that seemed to lean inward like old men sharing whispers. It looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile somehow, as if the years had been slowly erasing it from the world. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect. But the windows were clean, impossibly clean, and they reflected the overcast sky like dark mirrors. I stood on the porch for a long time before using the key. The metal was warm in my palm, warmer than it should have been after sitting in my pocket during the 2-hour drive. When I finally turned it in the lock, the door opened with a soft sigh, as if the house had been holding its breath. The smell hit me first, not the mustiness I'd expected, but something else. Something familiar that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. It was the scent of my grandmother's lavender soap mixed with the tobacco from my grandfather's pipe, and underneath it all, the faint metallic tang of old copper pennies. The smell of my childhood, preserved like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. The grandfather clock stood exactly where I remembered it, in the corner of the living room where it could watch over everything like a wooden sentinel. It was massive, nearly 8 feet tall, carved from dark mahogany with brass fittings that caught what little light filtered through the windows. The pendulum hung motionless behind its glass door, and the hands pointed to 11:47, though whether morning or evening I couldn't tell. I set my overnight bag down and walked closer. The clock face was beautiful in the way that old things can be, with Roman numerals etched in gold and delicate filigree work around the edges. But there was something else, something that made me step back instinctively. The minute hand was pointing backward, not just stopped, but actually reversed, as if time itself had decided to run in the wrong direction. "That's impossible," I said aloud, and my voice sounded strange in the empty house, flat and muffled as if the walls were absorbing the sound. I circled the clock slowly, looking for some mechanical explanation. Maybe the hands had been installed backward, or perhaps there was some kind of reverse mechanism I didn't understand. But as I studied it more closely, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. The numbers themselves seemed wrong. Not obviously wrong, but subtly off, like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed. The Ruthitan at the top appeared to shimmer when I wasn't looking directly at it, and the VI at the bottom seemed to sink deeper into the wood than the others. I reached for the glass door, intending to examine the hands more closely, but the moment my fingers touched the brass handle, the house around me seemed to shift. Not physically, the furniture didn't move. The walls didn't change, but something in the very air itself shifted, like the moment between sleeping and waking when you're not sure which world is real. The clock ticked. Just once, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and in that tick, I could have sworn I heard something else. A whisper, so faint it might have been the wind, but the windows were closed and the air was still. I jerked my hand back and stepped away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Clocks don't just start ticking on their own, especially clocks that have been broken for decades. But as I watched, the second hand, which I was certain hadn't been moving before, gave another tiny jerk backward, not forward, like time should move, but backward, as if it were unwinding the moments instead of counting them. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned a degree in engineering and spent 15 years designing bridges and buildings, insisted there had to be an explanation. Old mechanisms could be unpredictable. Temperature changes could cause metal to expand and contract in unexpected ways. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for what I was seeing, but the irrational part, the part that still remembered being 8 years old and afraid of the dark corners in this same house, whispered that some things couldn't be explained, away with logic and reason. I left the living room and spent the rest of the afternoon going through my grandfather's things, trying to focus on the practical matters of inheritance. His bedroom was exactly as I remembered it. The same patchwork quilt on the bed, the same water stain on the ceiling, The same photograph of my grandmother on the nightstand, her smile frozen in sepia tones. But everything felt somehow temporary, as if it were all just waiting for him to come back. In his desk, I found the usual detritus of a long life. Bills and receipts, old letters tied with ribbon, a collection of pocket watches in various states of repair. My grandfather had been fascinated by timepieces, I remembered now. He'd had a small workshop in the basement where he would spend hours tinkering with gears and springs, his thick fingers surprisingly delicate as they manipulated the tiny mechanisms. But it was in the bottom drawer that I found the journal. The leather cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the pages were filled with my grandfather's careful handwriting. Most of it seemed to be technical notes about clock repair, diagrams of gear ratios, calculations for pendulum weights, observations about the behavior of different metals over time. But scattered throughout were other entries, written in a different hand, more urgent and cramped, as if whoever was writing was trying to get the words down before they forgot them. October 15th, 1962. The clock stopped again last night. Mary says I'm imagining things, but I know what I saw. The hands moved backward for exactly 17 minutes before stopping at 11:47. Found Harold in his crib this morning, crying like he'd had a nightmare. He's only 6 months old. Babies don't have nightmares. October 23rd, 1962. It's happening more frequently now. The clock runs backward almost every night, always stopping at the same time. Mary won't talk about it anymore. She says I'm scaring her. But I'm not the one who should be scared. It's not running backward. It's trying to take us backward. I can feel it in my bones, like gravity pulling in the wrong direction. November the 2nd, 1962. I tried to move the clock today. As soon as I touched it, I could see them. All the moments it's been collecting, stored up like photographs in an album. I saw Harold's first steps, which haven't happened yet. I saw Mary's hair turning gray, which won't happen for 20 years. I saw my own funeral, which, God help me, which happens tomorrow if I don't stop this. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. The entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating into something barely legible. But I could make out enough to understand that my grandfather, Harold, the baby mentioned in the early entries, had been dealing with this clock his entire life. The clock isn't broken. It never was broken. It's working exactly as it was, designed to work. But it wasn't designed by human hands, and it doesn't measure human time. It measures something else, something that moves backward through our lives like a river flowing uphill. And every tick takes us closer to where we started, which is the same place we'll end. The final entry was dated just 3 days ago. It's almost time. I can feel it winding down, all those years I borrowed coming due. The clock has been patient, but patience isn't the same as forgiveness. Harold will inherit the house, and with it the responsibility. I tried to warn him once, tried to explain, but he was young and angry and certain that old men don't know anything about the world. Maybe he was right. Maybe I don't know anything about the world. But I know about time, and I know about debt. And I know that some things can't be fixed no matter how skilled your hands are. The clock ticks backward because that's the only direction left to go. We spend our whole lives moving forward, accumulating moments like interest in a bank account, never realizing that someday the bill will come due. The clock is just the collection agency. It's been waiting so patiently, counting down instead of up, measuring what we owe instead of what we've earned. I'm sorry, Harold. I'm sorry I couldn't explain it better when you were young enough to listen. I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to stop it. I'm sorry I'm leaving you to figure it out alone. But maybe that's how it has to be. Maybe that's how it's always been. I closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness, trying to process what I'd read. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. The house felt different now, not empty but expectant, as if it were waiting for something to happen. From the living room came the sound of ticking, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, but wrong somehow, like a heartbeat played in reverse. I walked back to the living room on unsteady legs. The grandfather clock was running now, its pendulum swinging back and forth with hypnotic regularity. But as I watched, I realized that everything about its movement was backward. The pendulum swung from right to left instead of left to right. The hands moved counterclockwise. Even the sound seemed to come before the movement, as if the effect were preceding the cause. The time read 11:46. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to understand. When I'd first seen the clock, it had read 11:47. Now it read 11:46. It was running backward, unwinding time like a spool of thread, taking us all back to some moment that had never quite been finished. As I watched, the minute hand moved again, backward, always backward, and the time changed to 11:45. My mouth went dry. According to my grandfather's journal, he'd been found dead sitting in his chair facing the clock. The lawyer had said it looked like he was waiting for something. But what if he hadn't been waiting for something to happen? What if he'd been waiting for something to unhappen? The clock ticked again, and I felt something inside my chest respond to the sound. Not my heart, which was racing with fear, but something deeper and more fundamental. Something that recognized the rhythm and wanted to match it, to synchronize with that backward beat and let it carry me away from this moment, away from this responsibility, away from the weight of understanding that was settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I thought about my grandfather as a young man, standing in the same room, watching this same clock count down the years of his life. I thought about all the times he'd tried to call me over the past 15 years, and how I'd let those calls go to voicemail because I was still angry about things that seemed so petty now. I thought about the last conversation we'd had, when I'd accused him of living in the past, of being unable to move forward with the times. 43. Maybe he hadn't been living in the past. Maybe the past had been living in him, carried backward by a clock that counted down instead of up, that measured debt instead of growth, that ticked away the borrowed time we all spend without realizing we'll have to pay it back someday. The pendulum continued its hypnotic swing, and with each tick I felt myself being pulled deeper into its rhythm. It would be so easy to just sit down in my grandfather's chair and let the clock take me wherever it was going. To stop fighting the current and let it carry me back to the source, to the moment before everything went wrong, before the anger and the pride and the years of silence that had built up between us like scar tissue over a wound that had never quite healed. But as the minute hand crept backward toward 11:42, I remembered something else from the journal. My grandfather had written about seeing moments that hadn't happened yet. His son's first steps, his wife's gray hair, his own funeral. The clock didn't just move backward through time, it moved through all time, collecting moments like interest and storing them up for some future reckoning. What if the debt wasn't mine to pay? What if my grandfather had been carrying it all these years? Not because he'd inherited it, but because he'd chosen to. What if the clock only had power over those who accepted its authority, who believed they owed it something? 11:41. I walked to the clock and placed my hands on its wooden case. The moment I made contact, the world exploded into sensation. I could see everything, Every moment the clock had witnessed, every second it had stolen, every life it had slowly unwound like a ball of yarn. I saw my grandfather as a baby, crying in his crib while the clock ticked backward above him. I saw him as a young man, newly married, trying desperately to understand what was happening to his family. I saw him as a father watching his son grow up under the shadow of something he couldn't explain. I saw him as an old man, tired and worn down by decades of carrying a burden that was never his to carry. And I saw the truth. The clock wasn't collecting a debt. It was offering an escape. Every tick backward was a chance to undo, to unlive, to return to a time before responsibility and pain and the terrible weight of being human. It was seductive in the way that all escapes are seductive, not because they're good, but because they're easier than staying and fighting and accepting that some things can't be fixed. My grandfather had spent his whole life thinking he owed the clock something, when all along the clock had been trying to collect on a debt he'd never actually incurred. The real trap wasn't the backward ticking, it was the belief that he had to submit to it. I opened the glass door and grabbed the pendulum with both hands, stopping its swing. The silence that followed was deafening. Not just the absence of ticking, but the absence of that backward pull, that gravitational force that had been trying to drag everything in the room into its reversed orbit. The clock shuddered once, like a living thing in pain, and then went still. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the hands began to move again, but this time they moved forward. The minute hand crept from 11:41 to 11:42, then to 11:43, catching up to the present moment with mechanical precision. When it reached 11:47, it kept going. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my grandfather's chair, watching the clock keep ordinary time, as dawn broke through the windows, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to tell me all those years ago. Some debts are real, and some are imaginary, and the trick is learning the difference before you spend your whole life paying for something you never actually borrowed. The clock still ticks in my grandfather's house. I visit it sometimes when the weight of the present becomes too heavy, and I need to remember that time only moves in one direction, forward, toward whatever comes next, carrying us all toward a future that's uncertain but real. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is rattling the windows and the house feels too quiet, I think I can hear another sound underneath the steady tick-tock of normal time. A whisper, faint as breathing, counting backward from some number I'll never know, offering an escape I'll never take. The clock that ticked backward taught me something my grandfather spent his whole life learning. The most dangerous debts are the ones we convince ourselves we owe, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to pay them.